The city seemed to wake up only after Ethan Cole did. As dawn painted the skyline in shades of gold, the top floor of Cole International Holdings was already alive with activity. Assistants hurried through polished hallways carrying tablets and coffee. Phones rang without pause. Digital screens displayed stock prices from markets around the world. Every second was measured, every decision worth millions. At the center of it all stood Ethan Cole. At 34, he had become one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the country. Standing over 6 feet tall, with neatly styled dark hair and a composed expression that rarely betrayed his emotions, Ethan carried himself with quiet confidence. Tailors competed to dress him. Business magazines called him the golden mind of modern finance. Television anchors praised his leadership. Investors trusted his instincts. From the outside, his life appeared flawless. He owned luxury homes in several cities, flew in a private jet, drove cars most people only admired in magazines, and sat on the boards of companies spanning technology, real estate, healthcare, and renewable energy. People often said he was a man who had everything. Only Ethan knew how untrue that statement was. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, looking down at the sea of traffic far below. Thousands of people hurried through the streets, each chasing dreams of success. Behind him, his executive assistant, Melissa, carefully placed a leather folder on his desk. "Your schedule for today, Mr. Cole." Without turning around, Ethan nodded. "Go ahead. You have a breakfast interview with Global Business Network at 8. The board meeting begins at 10. Lunch with the Minister of Commerce at 1. A video conference with our European investors at 3. Your Charity Foundation Gala Planning Committee arrives at 5. She hesitated before adding with a smile. And dinner with Mississippi Victoria Lane at 7. Only then did Ethan turn around. He forced a polite smile. "Thank you, Melissa." As soon as she left, the smile disappeared. Dinner with Victoria. Once, those words had filled him with excitement. Now they felt like another appointment on an endless calendar. His phone buzzed repeatedly. "Congratulations on another record quarter. Can we schedule an interview? Would you consider investing in our company? Invitation to the governor's banquet. Invitation to the International Business Awards. Invitation to a luxury yacht exhibition." His inbox overflowed with requests. Not one message simply asked how he was doing. He closed the phone and slipped it into his pocket. Sometimes the silence inside his heart felt louder than the applause outside. The television studio buzzed with energy. Bright lights illuminated the modern stage as cameras prepared to broadcast live across the nation. The host greeted Ethan warmly. "Mr. Cole, welcome back. It's good to be here." The interview began smoothly. "Ethan, you've built an empire worth billions before turning 35. What's your secret?" Ethan smiled politely. "Surround yourself with honest people. Success is never built alone." "What motivates you every morning?" He paused for a fraction of a second. "The responsibility." "And what is your biggest dream?" For the first time during the interview, Ethan's answer wasn't rehearsed. "To build something that outlives me." The audience applauded. The host leaned forward. "Business magazines describe you as the country's most eligible bachelor. Your engagement to Victoria Lane has become one of the biggest society stories this year. Wedding preparations must be exciting." Another polite smile. "They're moving along. What makes Victoria special?" Again Ethan paused. He searched for words that suddenly felt difficult to find. "She brings elegance into every room." It sounded convincing enough for television. But even he noticed he hadn't mentioned love. By noon, Ethan was back inside headquarters. The quarterly board meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. Charts filled giant digital screens. Executives applauded another record-breaking financial report. "Our profits have increased by 23%. Our expansion into East Africa exceeded projections. Our renewable energy division is outperforming expectations." Every announcement was followed by applause. Every executive congratulated Ethan. Every compliment sounded exactly like the one before it. Brilliant leadership. Outstanding vision. exceptional decision-making. The words blended together until they became meaningless. After the meeting, Daniel Carter, Ethan's oldest friend and the company's chief legal counsel, walked beside him toward the executive elevator. Daniel had known Ethan long before the billions, long before magazine covers, long before private jets. "You look tired," Daniel observed. "I'm fine." "No." Daniel smiled knowingly. "You're functioning. That's different." Ethan laughed quietly. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who actually knows you." The elevator doors opened. Before stepping inside, Daniel looked at him carefully. When was the last time someone talked to Ethan instead of talking to the billionaire? The question lingered in the air. Neither man answered it. That evening, the rooftop restaurant overlooked the glittering skyline. Crystal chandeliers reflected against the windows while a string quartet played soft classical music. The entire restaurant had been reserved. Not because Ethan requested it, because the owner insisted. Victoria Lane arrived 15 minutes late. She looked stunning in a designer evening gown that probably cost more than most families earned in several months. She kissed Ethan lightly on the cheek. "I'm sorry I'm late." "It's all right." She immediately lifted her phone. "Hold on." She adjusted the lighting, smiled, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Let's take a picture." Before Ethan could respond, she leaned against him. Click. Another angle. Click. One more. Click. She studied the photos carefully. "This one is perfect." "Perfect for what?" "My followers." She laughed. "Our engagement posts always get incredible engagement." Ethan smiled politely again. The smile felt increasingly unfamiliar. Dinner was served. Victoria barely touched her food. Instead, she talked excitedly. "The wedding venue called. The florist has imported roses from Europe. The guest list now includes 3 governors. My stylist found the perfect diamond accessories. Our wedding is going to dominate every lifestyle magazine. Our honeymoon resort has a private island." Every sentence began with "I." Not once did she ask about Ethan's day. Not once did she ask whether he was happy. He quietly listened. When dessert arrived, Victoria's phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. "Oh, that's Amelia. My college friend?" "Yes. I'll just say hello." She stood. "I'll be back." Ethan nodded. She walked toward the outdoor terrace, unaware that the sliding glass door remained slightly open. Ethan wasn't trying to eavesdrop. He simply reached for his glass of water. Then he heard laughter. Loud laughter. Victoria's voice. "Oh, please." More laughter. "No, I'm serious." Pause. "You think I'd have accepted his proposal if he worked a normal job?" Another burst of laughter. Ethan froze. His hand stopped halfway to the glass. Victoria continued. "He's kind. I'll give him that. But kindness doesn't buy beachfront villas." She laughed again. "Love is wonderful. But money is practical." A brief silence followed before she spoke once more. "My mother always told me to marry up. And honestly," she lowered her voice slightly, "if someone richer came along." She shrugged. "I'd at least listen." The words landed like blows. Ethan felt as though the air had been knocked from his lungs. His heartbeat echoed inside his ears. He wanted to believe he had misunderstood. He wanted to believe there was context. There wasn't. Amelia's muffled voice asked another question. Victoria answered without hesitation. "Do I love him?" She chuckled. "I love the life that comes with him." Silence. Heavy. Unforgiving. Ethan stared through the restaurant window at the woman he had planned to marry. The woman who had accepted his proposal with tears in her eyes. The woman who had spoken endlessly about forever. The woman who had chosen the wedding venue before asking what kind of marriage they wanted. For the first time, he wondered whether every smile had been rehearsed, every kiss calculated, every promise priced. He quietly stood. There was no anger on his face. No dramatic confrontation. No shouting. Only disappointment. Deep, immeasurable disappointment. He walked toward the restaurant entrance. The manager hurried over. "Mr. Cole." Is everything all right? Ethan reached into his wallet and placed his credit card on the table. Please settle the bill. But, sir, dessert. I have to leave. He walked into the elevator alone. Behind him, the city lights sparkled as beautifully as ever. Yet somehow they had never seemed so cold. An hour later, Ethan sat alone in the library of his penthouse. The room, lined with shelves of leather-bound books, had always been his refuge. Tonight, even it felt empty. He loosened his tie and replayed Victoria's words over and over in his mind. I love the life that comes with him. Not him. His life. His money. His status. His name. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Daniel entered after receiving permission. I came as soon as I got your message. One look at Ethan's face told him something was terribly wrong. What happened? Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the large fireplace and stared into the dancing flames. Finally, he spoke. Tell me something, Daniel. If tomorrow every company I own disappeared, if every dollar vanished, if I became an ordinary man, he turned slowly. Who would still stay? Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't, because he wasn't sure. After a long silence, Ethan gave a bitter smile. I thought I was building a life. He looked around the luxurious penthouse that suddenly felt like a museum. Maybe I've only been building a fortune. Outside, the city celebrated another successful day. Inside, the man everyone wanted realized that perhaps no one had ever truly wanted him at all. 3 months passed. To the outside world, Ethan Cole had simply disappeared from public life. The tabloids offered countless explanations. Some claimed the billionaire had traveled to Europe to recover from the heartbreak of his broken engagement. Others insisted he was secretly negotiating the largest corporate acquisition in the country's history. A few gossip bloggers even suggested he had checked himself into a luxury wellness retreat after suffering emotional exhaustion. No one knew the truth. Ethan had deliberately vanished. He hadn't stepped in front of a television camera since the night he walked away from Victoria. He declined interviews, canceled public appearances, and handed the day-to-day management of Cole International Holdings to the company's executive committee. Only one man knew where he was: Daniel Carter. Inside a quiet lakeside estate owned by the company, Ethan spent most of his days reading, thinking, and questioning everything he had once believed about success. One rainy afternoon, Daniel found him sitting on the wooden dock, watching ripples spread across the still water. You've been sitting here for 2 hours, Daniel said, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. Ethan accepted one with a faint smile. I lost track of time. You've been doing that a lot lately. The two friends sat in silence for several moments. The rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and fresh. Finally, Ethan spoke. Do you know what I've realized? Daniel looked at him. I've spent years believing money solved problems. It solves many. It creates just as many. Daniel didn't disagree. Ethan stared across the lake. When I was building my company, I believed people admired hard work. He laughed softly. They admired success. He paused. And once success became billions, they admired the billions. Daniel took a sip of coffee. You've met genuine people before. I have. But how many met me before they met my net worth? That question hung between them. Daniel had no answer. The following week, Ethan requested a meeting unlike any he had ever held before. Instead of bankers or investors, his conference room welcomed a retired special effects artist from the film industry, a prosthetic specialist, an orthopedic physician, a physical therapist, and one of the country's leading theatrical makeup designers. They looked at one another curiously. No one understood why one of the richest men in the country had invited them. Ethan stood at the head of the table. Thank you for coming. He pressed a remote. A single photograph appeared on the large screen. It showed an elderly homeless man sitting in a worn wheelchair beneath a highway bridge. I need your help. The room remained silent. I want to become invisible. One of the specialists frowned. I'm not sure I understand. Ethan took a deep breath. I want to disappear completely. The makeup artist exchanged puzzled glances with the others. You mean for security reasons? No. For personal reasons. Another silence. Then Ethan spoke the words that stunned everyone. I want to live as a crippled street beggar. Every face in the room froze. The orthopedic physician was the first to respond. Mr. Cole, surely you're joking. I'm not. You could be assaulted. I know. You could become sick. I know. You could lose everything. Ethan smiled sadly. I've already lost something far more valuable. No one spoke. He continued calmly. I've spent years wondering whether people loved me. Now I know many simply loved what I could give them. He looked around the room. I want to discover whether genuine kindness still exists. The special effects artist folded his arms. You're asking us to erase Ethan Cole. Exactly. And replace him with someone the world will ignore. Yes. The room fell quiet again. Finally, the elderly makeup artist nodded. If we're going to do this, we'll do it properly. Preparation began immediately. A private warehouse owned by Cole International was transformed into a temporary studio. For weeks, Ethan underwent one of the most unusual transformations imaginable. His expensive tailored suits disappeared. Luxury watches were locked away. Designer shoes were replaced with worn-out sandals. His neatly trimmed hair grew longer before being unevenly cut. His beard became rough and untidy. A dental specialist fitted temporary appliances that made several teeth appear chipped and crooked. The makeup team carefully darkened parts of his skin, added realistic wrinkles, age spots, sun damage, and the weathered appearance of someone who had spent years sleeping outdoors. Artificial scars were created along his neck and jaw. His eyebrows were subtly reshaped. His posture changed through months of physical training. The orthopedic physician taught Ethan how to sit in a wheelchair convincingly for long periods without unconsciously using healthy posture. A physical therapist coached him to keep one shoulder slightly lower than the other. He practiced speaking more slowly. Walking became another lesson. Although he intended to remain in a wheelchair most of the time, there would inevitably be moments when someone might briefly see him stand. Those movements had to appear painful. Hour after hour, he learned to drag one leg convincingly. He practiced falling safely. He learned how to transfer from a wheelchair without revealing his true strength. It was exhausting. One evening, after nearly 6 weeks of preparation, Ethan collapsed into a chair. I never realized how much effort disability requires. The orthopedic physician nodded. People often assume those living with disabilities simply adapt. He smiled gently. They work harder before breakfast than most people do all day. Those words stayed with Ethan. The experiment was already teaching him lessons he hadn't expected. Daniel visited almost every evening. One night, he found Ethan studying videos of homeless people collected from public documentaries. What are you watching? I'm learning. Daniel looked at the screen. Men eating donated meals. Women sleeping beneath cardboard shelters. Veterans sitting alone outside train stations. Children collecting bottles for recycling. Ethan quietly paused the video. I've walked past people like this my entire life. You've donated millions to homeless charities. I have. But donations happen from a distance. He leaned back. I've never understood what invisibility feels like. Daniel sighed. You don't have to do this. I do. No. You think you do. Ethan remained silent. Daniel continued. You already know some people are selfish. I don't need proof that selfishness exists. I'm looking for proof that kindness still does. As the 8th week approached, the disguise was complete. The team gathered in front of a full-length mirror. The man standing before them no longer resembled Ethan Cole. His face appeared nearly 15 years older. His skin looked rough from years of exposure to harsh weather. A thick gray beard concealed much of his jawline. One eye appeared slightly clouded through a specially designed cosmetic contact lens. His clothes were faded, stained, and patched together. His hands looked swollen and scarred. Even his scent had been altered using harmless theatrical techniques that mimicked weeks of life on the streets. The makeup artist smiled proudly. I've spent 40 years in cinema. This is the finest transformation I've ever created. Ethan stared into the mirror. He searched for himself. He couldn't find him. "Who do you see?" Daniel asked quietly. Ethan continued looking. Finally he answered. "A stranger." The makeup artist handed him a folded identity card. It was carefully aged to appear authentic. Name Edward Brooks. No fixed address. Date of birth 48 years earlier. Everything about Ethan Cole had vanished. "You'll need a name," Daniel said. Ethan looked at the card again. "Edward." He nodded slowly. "Edward Brooks." For the first time since beginning the transformation, he spoke the name aloud. "My name is Edward." It sounded strangely natural. The following morning, Daniel drove Ethan to an abandoned warehouse district. Parked inside was an old wheelchair. Its paint was chipped. The handles were worn smooth. One wheel squeaked with every rotation. Beside it lay a faded backpack containing only a thin blanket, bottled water, basic medicine, a notebook, and several changes of old clothing. Daniel handed Ethan a small emergency phone. "It only has one number. My number. You'll call if anything goes wrong." "I will." "You promise?" "I promise." Daniel hesitated before speaking again. "I still think this is the craziest idea you've ever had." Ethan smiled. "You've known me for 20 years. "I know. That's saying something." Both men laughed quietly. The laughter faded almost as quickly as it came. Daniel became serious. "If you decide you've learned enough, come home." Ethan nodded. "I will." Daniel reached out his hand. Instead of shaking it, Ethan embraced his oldest friend. "Thank you." "You don't have to thank me." "I do. For believing in me when I'm not sure I believe in myself." Daniel stepped back, fighting emotion. "You'll always be Ethan to me." Ethan smiled. "I hope one day someone loves Edward too." Without another word, he lowered himself into the wheelchair. For the first time, he felt its weight beneath him, its restrictions, its dependence. Even pushing the wheels required far more effort than he expected. He slowly rolled toward the warehouse exit. Bright sunlight poured through the open doors. Beyond them waited a world that no longer recognized him. At the threshold, Ethan stopped. He looked back one final time. Everything familiar lay behind him. His name, his wealth, his reputation, his comfort. Ahead lay uncertainty. He took a slow breath. Then he crossed the doorway. At that moment, Ethan Cole disappeared. The man who entered the city was not a billionaire. He was simply Edward Brooks, a crippled stranger in a battered wheelchair, carrying nothing but a blanket, a backpack, and one impossible question. Could anyone truly love a man who appeared to have nothing at all? The first thing Ethan noticed was not the hunger. It was the silence. Not the silence of an empty room or a quiet morning, but the strange silence that settled around a person no one wanted to acknowledge. As Edward Brooks, he sat in his battered wheelchair outside one of the busiest business districts in the city. Towering glass buildings reflected the morning sun, while thousands of office workers hurried toward their jobs with coffee cups in one hand and smartphones in the other. The sidewalks buzzed with life. Taxi horns echoed through the streets. Buses groaned to a stop. Street vendors called out to passing customers. Conversations floated through the cool morning air. Yet somehow Ethan felt completely alone. He positioned his wheelchair beneath the shade of a large tree near the entrance of a subway station. The location had been carefully chosen. It wasn't directly in anyone's way, but it was impossible to miss. Or so he thought. For nearly 20 minutes, hundreds of people walked past him. Not one made eye contact. Not one smiled. Not one even looked in his direction. It was as if he had become part of the sidewalk. A crack in the pavement. A forgotten bench. A trash can. He remembered walking through business districts like this countless times during his years as CEO. People had rushed toward him then. Executives had greeted him enthusiastically. Security guards had opened doors before he reached them. Reporters had shouted questions. Employees had smiled nervously whenever he passed. Now, nothing. A woman wearing expensive heels nearly bumped into his wheelchair. She frowned, not at herself but at him. "Move," she muttered without slowing down. Ethan looked around. There was nowhere to move. She sighed dramatically before stepping around him, as though he were an inconvenience placed there solely to ruin her morning. Within seconds, she disappeared into the crowd. The encounter lasted less than 5 seconds. Yet it lingered in Ethan's thoughts far longer. Around 9 o'clock, a middle-aged businessman hurried toward the subway entrance while talking loudly through a wireless earpiece. "I'm telling you, close the deal today." Without looking ahead, he accidentally kicked one of Ethan's worn shoes. The man stumbled slightly. Instead of apologizing, he glared at Ethan. "You people should stay out of the way." Then he continued walking as though nothing had happened. "You people." The words echoed inside Ethan's mind. "Not sir. Not, excuse me. Not even you. Just, you people." An invisible category. One he had never belonged to before. By lunchtime, the sidewalks grew even busier. The smell of grilled chicken, fresh bread, roasted corn, and coffee drifted through the air from nearby restaurants. Ethan hadn't eaten since dawn. His stomach growled. He reached into his backpack and removed the plain sandwich Daniel had packed that morning. Before taking a bite, he noticed an elderly homeless man sitting beneath a nearby bridge support. The man's clothes were even more worn than Ethan's. His beard was white. His hands trembled noticeably. He stared at the food vendors with quiet resignation. Without thinking, Ethan rolled his wheelchair toward him. "Would you like half?" The old man looked surprised. "You offering me your lunch?" Ethan nodded. "It's enough for both of us." The man smiled gently. "Most people only share after they've eaten." He accepted the sandwich. "My name's Walter." "Edward." They ate quietly. After several minutes, Walter spoke again. "You knew." Ethan hesitated. "Is it obvious?" Walter chuckled. "You still look around expecting people to notice you." Ethan frowned. "They don't." Walter shook his head. "Not unless they're complaining." The words struck harder than Ethan expected. Walter continued. "Give it a week. You'll stop expecting smiles. You'll stop expecting conversations. And eventually," he looked toward the busy street, "you'll stop expecting to matter." Ethan stared silently at the passing crowd. For the first time since beginning his experiment, fear settled into his chest. The afternoon brought another lesson. A group of teenagers walked past laughing loudly. One noticed Ethan. "Hey!" He nudged his friend. "Check this out." The 4 teenagers surrounded the wheelchair. One crouched in front of Ethan and exaggerated a fake limp. Another pretended to push an imaginary wheelchair while the others burst into laughter. "Race you! Come on, Grandpa! You'll never catch us!" They laughed hysterically. Ethan remained silent. One teenager pulled out his phone. "Smile!" He snapped several photos before running away. The laughter faded into the distance. Walter sighed from beneath the bridge. "They'll upload it." Ethan looked toward him. "What? Pictures?" "They love taking pictures. For them it's entertainment. For us," he shrugged sadly, "it's another reminder." Another reminder of what? That dignity could disappear the moment people stopped seeing humanity. As evening approached, the business district slowly emptied. Office workers climbed into luxury cars. Others hurried toward buses and trains. Restaurants filled with people meeting friends after work. Within an hour, the once crowded sidewalks became strangely quiet. The city looked different after sunset. Less polished, less hurried, more honest. Ethan pulled his thin blanket around his shoulders. The temperature dropped quickly. He had expected discomfort. He hadn't expected loneliness. For years he had ended each evening in spacious homes filled with warmth, soft lighting, and silence chosen by comfort. Now silence felt entirely different. It wasn't peaceful. It was abandoned. The second day began with rain. A cold, steady drizzle soaked the sidewalks before sunrise. People hurried beneath umbrellas without slowing down. Some splashed water directly onto Ethan as they rushed through puddles. Few even noticed. His clothes became damp. The wheelchair seat grew uncomfortable. The cold seeped into his back. Around mid-morning, a coffee shop employee stepped outside carrying a bucket of dirty mop water. Without checking the sidewalk carefully, he dumped it into the gutter. The filthy water splashed across Ethan's blanket. The employee glanced briefly in his direction. Instead of apologizing, he shrugged. Sorry. The word lacked any sincerity. He immediately returned inside. Ethan stared at his soaked blanket. The smell of detergent mixed with dirty water clung to the fabric. A month earlier someone would have replaced the blanket before he even asked. Now, no one cared. Later that afternoon, a little girl walking beside her mother slowed down. She couldn't have been older than 6. She looked directly at Ethan. Mommy! The mother kept walking. The little girl tugged gently on her hand. Mommy! What? Why is that man sitting there? The mother barely glanced toward Ethan. Don't stare. But is he okay? I said don't look. The child looked back one last time. Their eyes met. Unlike everyone else that day, she smiled. A small, innocent smile. Then she waved. Ethan smiled back. The mother quickly hurried her away. That tiny gesture stayed with him long after they disappeared. Children noticed people. Adults often trained themselves not to. On the 3rd morning, Ethan decided to observe instead of expecting. He counted. By noon, exactly 1,012 people had passed his location. He kept careful notes in the small notebook hidden inside his backpack. A contact. 23. People who smiled. 3. People who spoke kindly. 1. People who insulted him. 9. People who deliberately avoided looking at him. Almost everyone else. He closed the notebook slowly. Statistics suddenly felt painfully human. Near the end of the week, an expensive black luxury sedan stopped beside the curb. A chauffeur stepped out quickly and opened the rear door. A wealthy businessman emerged wearing a tailored suit remarkably similar to the kind Ethan himself had once worn daily. The man walked confidently toward one of the office towers. As he passed, Ethan recognized him immediately. Richard Mason, a real estate developer. They had attended charity galas together. Richard had once waited nearly an hour just to speak with Ethan at an investment conference. Now Richard walked within 6 feet of him. Close enough for conversation. Close enough to recognize his voice. Close enough to see his face. Yet Richard never looked at him. Not once. He entered the building without the slightest acknowledgement. Ethan sat perfectly still. If he had spoken Richard's name, would the man have recognized him? Probably. But that wasn't the point. The point was that Richard never imagined someone like him might deserve attention. Status determined visibility. Money determined importance. Without both, you disappeared. That evening Walter sat beside him, warming his hands around a paper cup of soup donated by a local shelter. You've been quiet. I'm thinking. Walter smiled knowingly. About what? Ethan looked toward the illuminated skyscrapers. I used to believe success made people respect you. Walter chuckled. No. What then? They respected what success could do for them. Ethan didn't answer. Walter continued. You know what's funny? What? The richest people often think poor people envy them. They don't. Some do. He shrugged. But most of us? We envy being noticed. Those words settled heavily over the evening. Not wealth. Not luxury. Not fame. Just acknowledgement. To be seen. To be greeted. To matter. Ethan leaned back in his wheelchair and watched office lights gradually switch off one floor after another. Somewhere high above, executives were likely discussing quarterly profits, mergers, and investment strategies. A few weeks earlier, he would have been leading those meetings. Now he sat on the sidewalk below, wrapped in a damp blanket, listening to the distant hum of traffic. The city had not changed. He had, or perhaps the city had always been this way. Perhaps he had simply been standing on the opposite side of the glass. As darkness settled over the streets, Ethan closed his eyes. This experiment was no longer about discovering whether someone could love a billionaire without knowing his wealth. It had become something much larger. For the first time in his life, he was beginning to understand what it meant to live without being seen. And somehow that hurt far more than hunger ever could. Monday mornings were always chaotic. The sidewalks outside the business district overflowed with people racing to begin another workweek. Taxi drivers leaned on their horns. Street vendors called out breakfast specials. Office workers balanced coffee cups, briefcases, and ringing phones as they hurried toward towering glass buildings. Edward Brooks sat quietly in his battered wheelchair beneath the familiar tree near the subway entrance. A cool breeze drifted through the street, carrying the aroma of freshly baked bread from a nearby cafe. It had been 8 days since Ethan had become Edward. 8 days of being ignored. 8 days of insults, pity, and silence. He had almost stopped expecting anything different. Walter, the elderly homeless man he had befriended, was sitting several yards away, carefully organizing a few donated blankets. "You'll catch a cold if you stay out here before sunrise," Walter called. Edward smiled faintly. "I've survived 8 mornings." Walter chuckled. "That's exactly how people end up with pneumonia." Before Edward could answer, another wave of commuters streamed past. A woman wearing a gray business suit walked so close that her handbag struck one of the wheelchair handles. She never noticed. A young man nearly stepped on Edward's foot while staring at his phone. He frowned as if Edward had inconvenienced him. An elderly gentleman dropped a coin into the small paper cup resting beside the wheelchair without slowing his pace. Clink. The coin echoed loudly. Edward looked down at it. He had placed the cup there only because every homeless person around him insisted people expected to see one. He still wasn't comfortable accepting money. Not because he didn't understand why people begged. Because he knew he could return to unimaginable wealth whenever he wished. Many around him couldn't. He quietly picked up the coin and slipped it into Walter's coat pocket when the older man wasn't looking. Walter would need it more. Across the street, Hannah Brooks hurried toward the crosswalk. She glanced at her wristwatch and sighed. "I'm going to be late." Her bicycle had broken down over the weekend, forcing her to take 2 buses instead of cycling to the kindergarten where she taught. She wasn't dressed in expensive designer clothes like many of the professionals around her. Instead, she wore a simple pale blue blouse tucked into a navy skirt, comfortable flats, and a cream-colored cardigan that had clearly been repaired at one sleeve. Her dark hair was neatly tied into a ponytail. There was nothing extravagant about her appearance. Yet her warm smile made her stand out more than luxury ever could. As she crossed the street, she noticed the man in the wheelchair beneath the tree. She slowed. Most people walked around him without looking. She looked, not for a second, long enough to notice his tired eyes, long enough to notice that his blanket was still damp from yesterday's rain, long enough to realize he wasn't asking anyone for anything. The traffic light changed. People behind her continued walking. For a brief moment she hesitated. Then she kept moving toward work. Edward watched her disappear into the crowd. Another person had looked, then continued walking. He wasn't disappointed. He had learned not to expect more. That afternoon, classes ended later than usual. One of Hannah's students had scraped his knee during recess and cried for nearly half an hour. Another refused to nap. A parent arrived 20 minutes late for pickup. By the time Hannah finally left the school, she felt exhausted. Her stomach growled. She realized she had skipped lunch while helping prepare decorations for the children's reading day. As she walked toward the bus stop, she passed the same business district. The man in the wheelchair was still there. He hadn't moved much. The afternoon sun had shifted, leaving him exposed to the heat. People continued flowing around him like water around a stone. Hannah stopped. She looked inside the paper bag she carried. Only one sandwich remained. She had planned to eat it during the bus ride home. She stood there for several seconds. Then she walked toward him. Edward noticed her approaching. Instinctively, he assumed she wanted directions. Or perhaps she was about to tell him he couldn't sit there. Instead, she smiled. "Good afternoon." The greeting startled him. It had been hours since anyone had spoken directly to him. "Good afternoon," he replied quietly. She held out the paper bag. "I packed 2 sandwiches this morning. Turns out I only needed one." Edward immediately understood the lie. The paper bag contained exactly 1 sandwich. She wasn't giving him extra food. She was giving him her dinner. I couldn't, he said gently. You should. No. You need it. So do you. She laughed softly. I'll survive until I get home. He looked at the sandwich, then at her. Thank you. She handed it to him. My grandmother always says food tastes better when it's shared. Edward accepted it carefully. Your grandmother sounds wise. She thinks so too. They both laughed. It was a small moment. Simple. Natural. For the first time since beginning his experiment, Ethan laughed without pretending. My name's Hannah, she said. Edward hesitated for only a heartbeat. My name is Edward. The lie came easier now. Not because he enjoyed lying. Because Edward had become real. Nice to meet you, Edward. You too. She glanced toward the nearby bench. Would you mind if I sat for a minute? He looked surprised. It's a public bench. I know. I was asking because I'd be joining your company. His company. No one had referred to sitting beside him that way before. Please. She sat down. For several moments neither spoke. Cars rolled past. Children laughed somewhere across the street. Pigeon landed nearby, searching for crumbs. Finally Hannah broke the silence. Have you been here long? About a week. She nodded thoughtfully. I pass this street every weekday. I've noticed. You have. Edward smiled awkwardly. It's hard not to notice someone who smiles while everyone else is rushing. She looked embarrassed. I smile because the children at school expect it. Kindergarten, he guessed. Her eyebrows rose. How did you know? You have glitter on your sleeve. She looked down. Tiny silver sparkles clung to her cardigan. She laughed. We made paper stars today. I forgot to brush them off. They suit you. The compliment caught her off guard. Thank you. She looked at him more carefully. His clothes were worn, his beard unkempt, yet his voice carried an unexpected calmness. His words were thoughtful, different, not what she expected. She stood after a few minutes. I should go. The buses become crowded. Edward nodded. Thank you again. For the sandwich? For stopping. She smiled. It seemed rude not to. Then she waved and walked away. Edward watched until she disappeared around the corner. Walter rolled his shopping cart closer. You know her? Edward shook his head. I just met her. Walter smiled knowingly. Interesting woman. You know her? Seen her before? Walter nodded toward the business district. Every few days she gives someone food. Sometimes me. Sometimes others. Edward looked in the direction Hannah had gone. So it wasn't because of me. Walter chuckled. No. It's because that's who she is. Those words warmed Ethan's heart more than the sandwich had. The next morning, Edward arrived at the same spot before sunrise. He told himself it was because the location attracted generous commuters. Deep down, he knew another reason. Around 8:15, Hannah appeared. She noticed him immediately. Instead of walking past, she changed direction. In one hand, she carried a steaming paper cup. I bought coffee before work. She held up a second cup. They accidentally made two. Edward looked at the cafe logo. The lid had his name written on it. Edward. She had ordered it intentionally. They made two? He asked with a smile. She bit her lip. Not exactly. I thought mornings were cold. So. She shrugged. I bought one for you. He accepted the cup carefully. It was still warm. His hands lingered around it. I haven't had coffee from a cafe in. He paused, remembering he couldn't say, a long time. She smiled. I hope it's good. He took one sip. Tasted ordinary. Yet somehow it felt extraordinary. Not because of the coffee. Because someone had thought about him before leaving home. No employee had done that because they had to. No investor because they wanted something. No journalist because it made headlines. Simply because she cared. For the next several days, Hannah continued stopping by. Never for long. Sometimes 2 minutes. Sometimes 5. Occasionally 10 if she wasn't rushing. She never asked uncomfortable questions. Never demanded to know how Edward had become homeless. never asked whether his disability was permanent. Instead, she asked ordinary questions. What book are you reading? Did the rain keep you dry? How's Walter today? What do you think of the weather? Questions that reminded him he was still a person. One Friday morning she arrived carrying a small paper bag. I brought muffins. You baked them? My students helped. Edward smiled. Should I be worried? She laughed. A little. They insisted on adding extra chocolate chips. He took a bite. They're wonderful. They're slightly burned. They're still wonderful. She smiled with quiet satisfaction. Across the street, several office workers glanced curiously toward the unusual sight. A young teacher laughing with a homeless man in a wheelchair. Most quickly looked away. Some frowned. Others whispered. Hannah never seemed to notice. Or perhaps she simply didn't care. Edward watched her animatedly describe one of her students who had insisted that dinosaurs still lived in his grandmother's backyard. Her laughter was genuine, unforced, infectious. As she stood to leave, she adjusted the strap of her worn handbag. I'll see you Monday. Edward blinked. The words felt strangely significant. Not goodbye, not maybe, not take care. I'll see you Monday. She expected him to be there. She expected to come back. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, that simple promise filled him with hope. As Hannah disappeared into the morning crowd, Walter wheeled his shopping cart beside Edward once again. You look different. Edward glanced at him. Different? Walter grinned. You smiled before she arrived. Edward looked down at the untouched half of his muffin. He hadn't even realized it. Walter's grin widened. I've lived on these streets for 15 years. I know the look. Edward shook his head, laughing. We've only spoken a few times. Walter shrugged. Sometimes hope doesn't need many conversations. Edward watched the crowd moving through the city. For 8 long days he had believed kindness had become rare. Then one ordinary kindergarten teacher had stopped. She hadn't seen a billionaire. She hadn't seen an opportunity. She hadn't seen a headline. She had simply seen a man sitting alone in a wheelchair. And for the first time since Ethan Cole disappeared from the world, Edward Brooks no longer felt invisible. The weeks settled into a quiet rhythm. Every weekday, at exactly 8:15 in the morning, Hannah Brooks appeared at the corner near the subway entrance. Sometimes she carried a cup of coffee. Sometimes it was a homemade muffin wrapped in wax paper. Sometimes she brought nothing at all except a warm smile and 5 minutes of conversation before rushing to the kindergarten. To anyone passing by, it looked ordinary. To Ethan, those few minutes became the brightest part of every day. He had begun measuring time differently. Not by business meetings. Not by quarterly reports. Not by stock prices. Instead, he measured mornings by the sound of Hannah's footsteps. Good morning, Edward. Her cheerful voice reached him before he saw her. He looked up from the worn novel resting on his lap. You're late. She widened her eyes dramatically. I am exactly 3 minutes late. I noticed. She laughed. You've become demanding. I've become observant. She held up a paper bag. The bakery gave me 2 cinnamon rolls. Ethan smiled knowingly. Did they? They may have sold me 2. I thought so. She playfully rolled her eyes before handing him one. You ask too many questions. I've been told that. They sat together while the city hurried around them. For several minutes neither spoke. Comfortable silence had slowly replaced awkward introductions. Felt natural now. Something Ethan hadn't experienced in years. After Hannah left for work, Walter slowly pushed his shopping cart toward Ethan. I've been meaning to ask you something. Ethan looked up. What is it? You know she's not rich, don't you? I assumed she wasn't. Walter nodded toward the direction Hannah had walked. She rides 2 buses every morning because her bicycle broke. Ethan frowned. I thought she chose public transport. Walter shook his head. No, couldn't afford the repairs. Ethan looked at the half-finished cinnamon roll still resting in his hand. Walter continued. She's one of those people. What do you mean? The kind who'll feed someone else before feeding themselves. Ethan remained silent. He suddenly remembered every coffee, every pastry, every sandwich. Until now, he had accepted them simply as thoughtful gestures. Now he wondered what each one had truly cost her. That afternoon, after Hannah finished teaching, she stopped at the neighborhood grocery store. She carried a handwritten shopping list folded neatly inside her purse. Milk, rice, cooking oil, medicine for Grandma Rose, bread, eggs, laundry soap. She pushed a small shopping basket through the narrow aisles, carefully comparing prices. When she reached the dairy section, she sighed. The milk went up again. She quietly returned it to the shelf. Instead, she picked up powdered milk. It was cheaper. Near the pharmacy counter, she paused again. The medication prescribed for her grandmother had increased in price for the second time that month. Hannah counted the money in her wallet. $324. She calculated silently. Medicine, rent, electricity, bus fare, food. She bit her lower lip. Something would have to wait. The pharmacist noticed her hesitation. You can buy half the prescription. Hannah smiled politely. I'll take half. I'll come back next week for the rest. The pharmacist nodded sympathetically. She wasn't the first customer forced to make that choice. She wouldn't be the last. That evening, Hannah climbed the stairs to the tiny second-floor apartment she shared with her grandmother. The building was old. The paint had faded years ago. The hallway lights flickered. The plumbing groaned whenever someone upstairs used water. Yet Hannah always called it home. As soon as she opened the door, the familiar smell of vegetable soup welcomed her. Grandma Rose looked up from the small stove. You're home. I am. You look tired. I chased 24 5-year-olds all day. Rose laughed. I'd rather wrestle lions. So would I. Hannah kissed her grandmother's forehead before helping set the small dining table. Their apartment had only 2 rooms. The furniture was old but spotless. Every item had been repaired instead of replaced. The curtains had been sewn by Rose years earlier. The wooden dining table had belonged to Hannah's late parents. Nothing matched. Everything mattered. As they ate dinner, Rose noticed Hannah staring thoughtfully at her plate. What's on your mind? Hannah hesitated. I met someone. Rose smiled immediately. Oh, Hannah laughed. Not like that. He's an older man. Rose's smile faded slightly. I see. He lives on the street. Her grandmother quietly set down her spoon. The gentleman in the wheelchair? Hannah looked surprised. You've seen him? I passed him last week on my way to church. Rose nodded gently. He looked lonely. He does. Hannah stirred her soup. I don't understand. What? Everyone walks past him. Rose smiled sadly. My mother used to say people become uncomfortable when they're reminded how quickly life can change. Hannah looked up. So they look away. Rose nodded. It's easier. Silence settled over the room. Finally Rose asked softly, What's his name? Edward. A nice name. He reads books. Rose looked surprised. He reads. Every day. He speaks beautifully. He notices little things. Rose smiled knowingly. You're curious about him. I suppose I am. Be kind. I will. But don't pity him. Hannah frowned. I don't. I just. She searched for the right words. I think everyone deserves someone to say good morning. Rose reached across the table and squeezed her granddaughter's hand. You sound just like your mother. The following Friday brought heavy rain. Sheets of water poured from gray clouds before sunrise. Most commuters hurried beneath umbrellas. Others waited beneath building entrances until the storm eased. Ethan sat beneath the tree, but the wind pushed rain sideways, soaking his blanket despite the little shelter the branches provided. By 8 o'clock, his clothes were damp. His hands were cold. He assumed Hannah wouldn't come. No reasonable person would stop in weather like this. He watched the crowded sidewalk without much expectation. Then he saw her. She wore a bright yellow raincoat several sizes too large and struggled to keep an umbrella from turning inside out. Her shoes splashed through puddles as she hurried toward him. You came? Ethan said, unable to hide his surprise. She looked confused. Of course. It's raining. She laughed. I noticed. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a neatly folded waterproof blanket. I borrowed this from school. You'll get in trouble. I'll return it this afternoon. She carefully draped it across his lap. There. You'll stay warmer. Ethan stared at the blanket. You didn't have to do this. I know. Then why? She shrugged as though the answer were obvious. Because you were getting wet. Before he could reply, she handed him a small paper cup. Hot chocolate. He smiled. I thought you usually bought coffee. I figured today called for something better. The warmth spread through his hands. Not just from the cup. From the gesture. Hannah. Yes. Thank you. She smiled softly. You've thanked me enough. No. I don't think I have. Their eyes met for a brief moment before she glanced away. I should get to work. She hurried off into the rain. Ethan watched until the crowd swallowed her. Walter slowly approached beneath his own tattered umbrella. She bought that blanket yesterday. Ethan looked toward him. How do you know? I was outside the discount store. I saw her. Ethan frowned. She said she borrowed it. Walter shook his head. She didn't want you worrying. Ethan looked down at the blanket covering his legs. His chest tightened. She had lied. Not to deceive him. To protect him from feeling guilty. That afternoon, curiosity overcame him. After Hannah left work, Ethan quietly followed from a distance. Remaining in character, he pushed his wheelchair slowly along the sidewalks, while keeping several buildings between them whenever possible. He watched her stop at a bicycle repair shop. The mechanic wheeled out her old bicycle. I'm sorry, he said. The frame's cracked. It isn't safe. How much would it cost? The mechanic scratched his head. To repair. He named the amount. Hannah's shoulders sank. What about replacing it? He quoted another price. Even higher. She forced a smile. Thank you. She walked away without another word. Instead of taking a taxi, she continued on foot. Nearly 3 miles. Carrying groceries. In worn shoes, Ethan followed silently. Halfway home, she entered another pharmacy. From outside the window, he watched her hand over a few bills. The pharmacist returned several items to the shelf before placing only one medicine bottle into her bag. Again, she couldn't afford everything. Ethan clenched the wheelchair handles. His heart ached. Not because Hannah was poor, because she kept giving. Despite having so little herself. That evening Daniel arrived for one of their scheduled secret meetings. He parked discreetly in an underground garage several blocks away before walking to their usual location. You look troubled, Daniel observed. Ethan nodded slowly. I've spent years donating millions. Daniel waited. But today, I watched a kindergarten teacher choose between medicine for her grandmother and fixing her bicycle. He looked toward the city lights. And somehow she still found money to buy me hot chocolate. Daniel remained quiet. There are people with fortunes who have never sacrificed half as much. Ethan's voice softened. She has almost nothing. And yet she keeps giving. Daniel studied his friend carefully. You've fallen for her. Ethan smiled faintly. I don't know if it's love. What is it then? He looked at the waterproof blanket folded carefully across his lap. It's admiration. He paused. And maybe, for the first time in a very long time, I've met someone whose heart is worth more than everything I own. Far above them, the lights of Cripple International Holdings illuminated the skyline. Inside those offices, executives were negotiating deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Down on the sidewalk below, wrapped in a modest blanket bought by a woman who could barely afford it, Ethan realized he had witnessed a far greater investment. Not one made with money, but with compassion. And unlike every fortune he had ever built, this was the kind of wealth that could never be measured on a balance sheet. Spring quietly settled over the city. The bitter winds of winter gave way to warm mornings filled with birdsong and blooming trees that lined the sidewalks of the business district. Office workers seemed less rushed than before. Street cafes placed tables outside again. Children laughed in nearby parks, and the aroma of fresh coffee drifted through the streets long before sunrise. Nearly 3 months had passed since Ethan Cole disappeared from the world. For everyone else, he was still missing. For Hannah Brooks, he was simply Edward. And somewhere between shared breakfasts, quiet conversations, and ordinary mornings, they had become an important part of each other's lives. Every weekday at exactly 8:15, Hannah stopped beneath the large maple tree where Edward's wheelchair rested. She never stayed more than 15 minutes. She never missed a day unless school demanded it. Those few minutes became a routine both of them silently protected. Walter noticed it before either of them did. "You two have become family," the old man remarked one morning while sipping coffee from a paper cup. Hannah laughed. "Family?" Walter nodded confidently. "You argue. You laugh. You worry when the other isn't around. That's family." Edward smiled. "I think you're exaggerating." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Am I?" Neither of them answered. Walter simply chuckled and pushed his shopping cart toward another corner of the street. One Tuesday morning, Hannah arrived looking unusually exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes. Her normally cheerful smile seemed weaker. Edward immediately noticed. "You didn't sleep." She blinked. "Is it that obvious? You've yawned 3 times since crossing the street." She laughed softly. "I was grading art projects until midnight. I thought kindergarten teachers mostly colored pictures." "We do." She smiled. "Then we spend hours trying to figure out what the pictures are supposed to be." Edward laughed. "I imagine that takes talent." "It does." She pulled several folded sheets of paper from her bag. "My students insisted you should have these." She handed them to him. The pages were covered with colorful crayon drawings. Stick figures, flowers, dogs, trees. One picture showed a smiling man sitting in a wheelchair beneath a tree. Beside him stood a woman holding 2 cups. Above them, written in uneven letters, were the words, "Friends." Edward stared at the drawing longer than he expected. "They drew me." Hannah nodded. "I told them about my friend Edward." He looked up. "You called me your friend?" She smiled as though the answer were obvious. "Aren't you?" Something tightened in Ethan's chest. For years, newspapers had called him an influential entrepreneur. Television hosts had called him a visionary. Investors had called him brilliant. For some reason, being called a friend meant more than any of those titles. "I'd like to think so." She smiled. "Good." Their conversations grew longer. Not because either intended them to, because time simply disappeared whenever they talked. One morning they debated whether books were better than movies. Another day they laughed over embarrassing childhood memories. Edward told carefully edited stories from his youth, changing names and places to protect his identity. "I used to climb trees when I was little," he said. "My mother hated it." "Were you good at it?" "I was fearless. And now," he looked at the wheelchair, "I've become more careful." The answer carried 2 meanings. Hannah only understood one. She nodded sympathetically. "I think life does that to everyone." Another afternoon she described her first day as a teacher. "I was more frightened than the children." I accidentally introduced myself twice." Edward laughed. "What did the children do?" One little boy raised his hand. "And?" "He asked if I had forgotten my own name." Edward laughed so hard he nearly dropped the paper cup in his hands. People walking past glanced curiously toward them. A homeless man laughing loudly with a young teacher. Some frowned. Others smiled. Neither Hannah nor Edward noticed. As the weeks passed, Ethan found himself forgetting he was acting. He still remained cautious. He still protected his secret. But around Hannah, pretending became increasingly difficult. One morning she arrived carrying a newspaper. The front page featured a large photograph of Cole International Holdings. The headline read, "Cole International announces record profits despite CEO's extended absence." Edward instinctively looked away. Hannah noticed. "You don't like business news?" He shrugged. "It reminds me of another life." She tilted her head. "You used to work in an office?" He realized his mistake. "A long time ago." What did you do? His mind raced. I helped with paperwork. What kind? Mostly financial records. She smiled. No wonder you're so organized. Edward relaxed slightly. The conversation moved on. But for several minutes afterward, he silently scolded himself. You have to be more careful. That evening Daniel met him in their usual underground parking garage. You nearly slipped today. Ethan frowned. How did you know? I had someone keeping an eye on you. Ethan sighed. I mentioned financial records. Daniel folded his arms. You spent 15 years running one of the world's largest companies. You can't erase that overnight. I know. You think differently. You speak differently. You notice things other people don't. Ethan leaned against the concrete wall. I'm trying. I know. Daniel smiled. But eventually she'll start asking questions. Ethan remained silent. The thought had crossed his mind more than once. The following Friday, Hannah arrived carrying a small chessboard. Edward looked surprised. You play? My grandfather taught me. She grinned. I found this at a thrift store. She placed the board across a nearby park table. I've never beaten him. She nodded toward Walter, who pretended not to hear. Walter laughed loudly. I let you win once. You absolutely did not. Edward smiled. I haven't played in years. Then this should be interesting. The game began. Within 5 minutes Hannah captured one of Edward's knights. She looked delighted. I'm winning. You are. 10 minutes later, Edward quietly sacrificed his queen. Hannah gasped. You made a mistake. Did I? 3 moves later. Checkmate. She stared at the board. No. Yes. I was winning. You were. What happened? Edward smiled. You focused on what was directly in front of you. You forgot the bigger picture. She narrowed her eyes. You're very good. I've had practice. Walter burst into laughter. I've never seen anyone lose while smiling so much. Hannah folded her arms dramatically. Rematch tomorrow. I'll be here. As she packed the chessboard away, she looked thoughtfully at Edward. You know. You don't seem like someone who spent his whole life on the streets. His heart skipped. What makes you say that? You quote books. You play chess. You speak. She searched for the word. Gracefully. Edward forced a small smile. My father loved books. He taught me whenever he could. That much was true. Only the details were different. She nodded. I wish I'd met him. So do I. The following week brought an unexpected incident. A delivery truck stopped beside the sidewalk. The driver climbed out, visibly frustrated. His cargo had shifted during transport, leaving several heavy boxes scattered near the rear doors. People walked around him without stopping. Everyone seemed too busy. Edward instinctively started analyzing the situation. If you move the lighter boxes first, he called out, you'll have room to slide the heavier ones without lifting them. The driver looked over. You think so? Edward nodded. The weight's leaning toward the left side. If you pull from the right, everything else should settle. The driver followed the suggestion. Within minutes, the problem was solved. He looked amazed. How'd you figure that out? Edward smiled. I've always enjoyed solving problems. The driver laughed. You should have been a logistics manager. Edward smiled quietly. If only you knew. Hannah had watched the entire exchange. As the truck drove away, she looked at Edward curiously. You notice things other people don't. He shrugged. I observe. That's an unusual skill. So is teaching 5-year-olds. She laughed. I suppose we're even. That Saturday, Hannah didn't come. Edward waited until nearly noon. No sign of her. He told himself not to worry. She probably had errands. Or perhaps she wanted to rest. By evening, he found himself glancing toward every passing bus. Walter noticed. She's not coming today. I know. You've looked up the street 32 times. Edward frowned. You counted. Walter grinned. I was bored. Edward laughed despite himself. The following Monday, Hannah finally appeared. I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize. My grandmother wasn't feeling well. Edward's expression immediately changed. Is she all right? She's better now. We spent most of Saturday at the clinic. I'm glad she's all right. Hannah smiled softly. You were worried. A little. She looked at him for several seconds before speaking. I missed our conversations too. The words escaped before she could stop them. Her cheeks turned slightly pink. Edward smiled. I missed them too. Neither spoke for a moment. The city continued moving around them. Cars passed. People hurried to work. Life carried on. Yet beneath the maple tree, time seemed to slow. That evening Ethan returned to the small apartment Daniel had secretly rented for their weekly meetings. Daniel was already waiting. How are things? Ethan sat quietly. I don't know what's happening. Daniel looked up from his laptop. What do you mean? I wake up looking forward to seeing her. He smiled faintly. If she doesn't come, the day feels incomplete. Daniel closed the laptop. Ethan, I know. You've fallen in love. Ethan looked toward the window overlooking the city skyline. I never planned to. I came here to discover whether kindness still existed. He laughed quietly. Instead, I found the kindest person I've ever known. Daniel remained silent. After a long pause, Ethan spoke again. The problem is... What? She doesn't know who I am. Daniel leaned forward. No. She knows exactly who you are. Ethan frowned. She knows Edward. Daniel nodded. And that's the remarkable part. He smiled warmly. For the first time in your adult life, someone cares about the man before the money. Ethan didn't answer. He simply stared at the city lights shimmering beyond the window. For years he had believed love was found in grand gestures, luxury vacations, diamond rings, and extravagant promises. Now he realized love often arrived much more quietly. It was found in shared coffee beneath a maple tree, in childish crayon drawings that called two people friends, in conversations that made 15 minutes feel like seconds, in worrying when someone failed to appear, in missing them before understanding why. Somewhere along the way, without either of them intending it, a billionaire pretending to be a forgotten beggar and a kindergarten teacher with more kindness than money had begun building something neither of them expected. Not through wealth, not through appearances, but through the slow, gentle trust that only grows when two hearts meet without pretense. And although Ethan had started this journey searching for proof that genuine kindness still existed, he was beginning to fear he had found something even more dangerous. He was falling in love, and for the first time in months, that frightened him more than losing his fortune ever had. The first storm of the season arrived without warning. The morning had begun warm and bright, with sunlight spilling across the glass towers of the business district. By early afternoon, however, dark clouds rolled across the sky, swallowing the sun and turning the city gray. A cold wind swept through the streets. Pedestrians quickened their pace. Store owners rushed outside to pull awnings over their entrances. Within minutes, rain began falling in thick, heavy sheets. Edward pulled the waterproof blanket Hannah had bought him tightly around his shoulders. He smiled faintly. She had insisted it was borrowed from the school. Walter had told him the truth weeks earlier. She had skipped buying herself a new pair of shoes to afford it. Even now, whenever Ethan touched the blanket, he was reminded that the smallest gifts often carried the greatest sacrifices. Across the street, office workers crowded beneath building entrances, waiting for the rain to ease. No one noticed the man sitting alone beneath the maple tree. No one except Walter. The elderly homeless man pushed his shopping cart toward Edward. You'll freeze sitting here. I've survived worse. Walter snorted. That's exactly what stubborn people always say. Edward chuckled. You sound like Hannah. Walter smiled. Good. Somebody has to keep you alive. By evening, the rain finally stopped. The sidewalks glistened beneath the streetlights. Water dripped steadily from tree branches. Traffic moved slowly through puddles that reflected the glowing city skyline. Edward adjusted the worn blanket over his lap and prepared for another quiet night. The business district emptied quickly after working hours. Only a few late commuters remained. Then he heard laughter. Loud, mocking. For young men staggered down the sidewalk. Their clothes were expensive. Their voices carried the careless confidence of people who had never worried about consequences. The smell of alcohol reached Edward before they did. There he is. One of them pointed toward the wheelchair. The professor. Another laughed. I've seen this old guy before. He sits here every day. The tallest of the group walked directly toward Edward. You collecting enough money today, old man? Edward remained calm. I've had a peaceful day. The young man crouched until their faces were level. You talk funny. My parents taught me manners. His friends burst into laughter. Ouch. He thinks he's better than us. The tallest man's smile disappeared. Without warning, he kicked the paper cup beside Edward's wheelchair. The few coins inside scattered across the wet pavement. Walter immediately started toward them. Leave him alone. One of the younger men shoved Walter backward. The old man stumbled but managed to stay on his feet. Edward gripped the wheels of his chair. Please, just go. Instead of leaving, another young man stepped behind the wheelchair. I wonder how fast this thing goes. Before Edward realized what was happening, the young man pushed the wheelchair violently forward. The chair rolled across the wet sidewalk. His front wheel struck the edge of the curb. Edward lost his balance. The wheelchair tipped sideways. He crashed onto the rain-soaked pavement. Pain shot through his shoulder as his body struck the concrete. His hands instinctively reached out to break the fall. He quickly remembered he couldn't move like a healthy man. He forced himself to remain awkwardly on the ground. The four men laughed. Did you see that? He's swimming. One of them pulled out a phone. This is going online. Walter rushed forward. You should be ashamed. The tallest man shoved him again. Mind your business, Grandpa. It's everyone's business when you hurt someone. Oh, really? The young man stepped closer. What are you going to do about it? Walter's jaw tightened. Nothing. There was nothing he could do. Not against four younger men. Not with his aging body. Edward looked toward the nearby office buildings. People stood beneath covered entrances. Watching. No one moved. No one intervened. Some looked uncomfortable. Others quickly turned away. The world kept walking. Stop! A familiar voice echoed across the sidewalk. Every head turned. Hannah. She had just stepped off the evening bus, still wearing her pale blue blouse from work. She dropped her handbag and ran toward the group. What are you doing? The tallest young man rolled his eyes. Relax. We're just having fun. She glared at him. Does this look funny to you? Her voice trembled with anger. The young man shrugged. He's just some homeless guy. Hannah took another step forward. No. He's a human being. Silence. The words seemed to catch even the drunken men off guard. One laughed awkwardly. Mind your own business. I am. She pointed toward Edward lying on the ground. My business is standing up for someone who can't defend himself. The tallest young man looked around. People were watching now, not because Edward had fallen, because someone had finally challenged them. He clicked his tongue. Forget it. He waved dismissively toward his friends. Let's go. The four men disappeared into the crowd, still laughing as though nothing had happened. Hannah didn't even watch them leave. She dropped to her knees beside Edward. Edward, can you hear me? He forced a weak smile. I've heard louder greetings. Tears filled her eyes. You scared me. She carefully examined his hands, his shoulder, his forehead. Does anything hurt? My pride. She shook her head. I'm serious. So am I. He smiled gently. I'll be all right. Walter finally reached them. They pushed him. I saw. Hannah's hands trembled as she helped Edward sit upright. Can you move your arms? A little. She looked at the overturned wheelchair. One wheel bent awkwardly beneath the frame. Oh no! Walter sighed. It's broken. Hannah stared at the damaged chair. Can it be repaired? Walter slowly shook his head. Not tonight. Rainwater soaked Edward's clothes. His blanket lay in a muddy puddle several feet away. Without hesitation, Hannah removed her cardigan and wrapped it around his shoulders. "You'll get cold. So will you." "I'll survive." Edward looked into her eyes. "You always say that." She smiled sadly. "And so do you." A city bus stopped nearby. Passengers stepped off. None offered assistance. One elderly woman slowed briefly. "I'm sorry that happened." Then she continued walking. Hannah looked around desperately. "We can't leave you here." Walter nodded. "His chair won't move." She thought for only a second. "You're coming home with me." Edward blinked. "What?" "My apartment." "I can't." "You can." "I'll only be a burden." She folded her arms. "You've clearly never argued with kindergarten teachers." Walter laughed despite the situation. "She's got you there." Edward looked uncertain. "Hannah, I'm not leaving you on this sidewalk. There isn't much room." "I don't care. My grandmother won't mind." "You haven't asked her." "I don't need to." He smiled weakly. "You're very confident." "I'm very stubborn." "I've noticed." She laughed softly. "Good. Then stop arguing." It took nearly 20 minutes to reach Hannah's apartment. Walter borrowed a folding cart from a nearby convenience store. Together, he and Hannah carefully helped Edward onto it, while another kind passerby offered to pull the damaged wheelchair behind them. The walk felt much longer than usual. Every bump in the sidewalk reminded Ethan that he was supposed to be injured. Part of him felt guilty. Hannah believed every bruise was real. She fussed over him constantly. "Are you comfortable?" "Yes." "Does your shoulder hurt?" "A little." "We're almost there." She repeated those words at least 6 times. Walter smiled quietly each time he heard them. The apartment building was exactly as Ethan remembered from following Hannah weeks earlier. Old, modest, well cared for despite its age. As soon as the apartment door opened, the comforting aroma of chicken soup filled the hallway. Grandma Rose looked up from her knitting. "Hannah!" Then she noticed Edward. "Oh my goodness! What happened?" Hannah quickly explained everything. Rose's gentle face darkened with sadness. "People can be so cruel." She immediately stood. "Bring him inside. There isn't much space." "We'll make space." Walter carefully helped Edward into the small living room. Rose hurried to fetch towels. "I'll make tea." Hannah shook her head. "He needs dry clothes first." Rose nodded. "I still have your grandfather's pajamas. They'll fit." Edward looked embarrassed. "I really don't want to impose." Rose smiled warmly. "My husband always believed a stranger is simply a friend you haven't shared a meal with yet." She handed him the folded clothes. "The bathroom is through that door." Edward hesitated. Changing clothes meant removing part of his disguise. Fortunately, the prosthetics remained secure. "I'll manage." Once inside the bathroom, Ethan stared at his reflection. His fake scars remained convincing. His beard was intact. Only his eyes looked different. They looked emotional. He splashed cold water across his face, then quietly whispered to himself, "Don't forget who you are." But another voice answered inside him. Which one? Ethan or Edward? When he returned wearing Rose's late husband's oversized pajamas, Hannah couldn't help smiling. "They're a little big. I've worn worse." Rose placed a steaming bowl of soup before him. "Eat." "I couldn't." She raised an eyebrow. "That wasn't a suggestion." Walter burst into laughter. "I like your grandmother." "So do I." Edward accepted the bowl. The soup was simple. Chicken, carrots, potatoes, fresh herbs. Nothing extravagant. Yet after weeks of eating sandwiches and donated meals, it tasted extraordinary. Rose watched him carefully. "When was the last time you had homemade soup?" Edward paused. Longer than he intended. "A very long time." She smiled kindly. "Then have another bowl." Later that night, rain tapped softly against the apartment windows. Walter had already returned to his usual shelter beneath the bridge. Rose retired early after insisting Edward take the sofa for the night. Hannah spread an extra blanket across him. "There. You'll be warm. You've done enough. She shook her head. I don't think kindness works that way. He looked at her thoughtfully. What do you mean? You don't measure it. You simply give it. Silence settled between them. The tiny apartment was quiet. Outside, distant thunder rolled across the city. Hannah. Yes. Why? She frowned. Why what? Why do you keep helping me? She looked genuinely confused. Because you need help. There are hundreds of people like me. I know. Why me? She sat in the worn armchair opposite the sofa. For several moments she searched for the right words. When I was 12, she said softly, my father collapsed outside a train station. Ethan listened quietly. He had a heart attack. She lowered her eyes. People walked past him. His chest tightened. They thought he was drunk. They assumed someone else would stop. She swallowed hard. One woman finally called an ambulance. Her voice trembled. But it was too late. Silence filled the room. My mother used to tell me that if enough people had stopped, she couldn't finish the sentence. A tear rolled down her cheek. So I made myself a promise. She looked directly at Edward. If I ever see someone who needs help, I'll stop. No matter how busy I am. No matter how tired I am. No matter what other people think. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He finally understood. Her kindness wasn't accidental. It wasn't temporary. It wasn't because of him. It was the promise of a little girl who had watched the world keep walking while her father died alone. Hannah smiled through her tears. I can't save everyone. But I refuse to become someone who walks past. Edward looked at her with eyes full of emotion. In boardrooms, he had met brilliant people, powerful people, influential people. Tonight, sitting in a tiny apartment on a worn sofa, wearing borrowed pajamas, he realized he had never met anyone richer in character than the woman standing before him. As Hannah switched off the living room light and quietly wished him good night, Ethan lay awake staring at the ceiling. The rain continued falling outside. But inside that modest apartment, wrapped in borrowed blankets and surrounded by people who had almost nothing, he felt safer than he ever had in any of his mansions. For the first time since he had become Edward Brooks, he understood that home was never measured by its size. It was measured by the hearts that welcomed you inside. Morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Hannah's apartment, painting soft golden lines across the living room floor. Ethan opened his eyes slowly. For a brief moment he forgot where he was. The ceiling above him was old, with tiny cracks running through the white paint. The sofa beneath him was narrow and slightly worn. A faint aroma of freshly baked bread drifted in from the kitchen, mixed with the comforting scent of coffee. Then he remembered. The attack. The broken wheelchair. Hannah. Grandma Rose. He sat up carefully, making sure to maintain the stiff movements Edward had perfected over the past 3 months. Voices floated in from the kitchen. He's still asleep, Hannah whispered. He needs the rest, Rose replied. He looked exhausted. So do you. Hannah laughed softly. I'll sleep tonight. You always say that. Ethan smiled to himself. That phrase again. He quietly listened. Rose lowered her voice. You care about him. There was a brief silence. I care about people. Hannah. I do. Rose chuckled gently. I didn't ask about people. I asked about Edward. Another silence. Longer this time. Finally Hannah sighed. He's lonely. So. Her voice became almost thoughtful. I know what loneliness looks like. Rose didn't interrupt. When he smiles. Hannah continued quietly. It feels like he's trying to convince everyone else he's all right. Ethan closed his eyes. She had seen through him. Not his disguise. His sadness. A few minutes later, Hannah entered the living room carrying a tray. Good morning. Good morning. I hope you like pancakes. He looked at the neatly stacked pancakes, fresh fruit, and a steaming mug of tea. You made all this? Grandma supervised. Rose called from the kitchen. That means I did all the hard work. They laughed together. For a few precious moments, the apartment felt strangely peaceful. Not like the luxurious breakfasts Ethan had once eaten in dining rooms large enough to host 20 guests. This meal was simple. The plates didn't match. The chairs creaked. The coffee mugs had tiny chips around the edges. Yet every bite carried something money had never been able to buy. Warmth, conversation, belonging. After breakfast, Hannah examined the damaged wheelchair. The bent frame leaned awkwardly against the wall. One will refuse to turn. This can't be repaired. Ethan nodded. I figured. Rose frowned. How much does a new one cost? Hannah searched online using her old phone. The smile disappeared from her face. Her eyes widened. They're expensive. Very expensive. Far more than she had expected. She quietly locked the phone screen before anyone else noticed the price. It's all right, Edward said gently. I'll manage. You can't stay without a wheelchair. I've managed before. No. She folded her arms. We'll find a solution. Ethan recognized that determined expression. There would be no arguing. Later that morning, Hannah left for school while Rose remained home with Edward. As soon as the apartment door closed, Rose settled into the chair opposite him. For several moments, she knitted quietly. Click, click, click. Finally, she looked up. You speak like an educated man. Ethan's heart skipped. I've read many books. So has my pastor. Rose smiled kindly. He doesn't speak the way you do. Ethan searched for an answer. My parents valued education. They must have. Rose continued knitting. You notice little things. You sit very straight until you remember not to. His pulse quickened. Had she noticed that? You thank people before they finish helping you. You always let women sit first. You fold blankets neatly. You clean your dishes without being asked. She smiled gently. Those aren't habits people usually learn on the streets. Ethan forced himself to remain calm. My father believed manners cost nothing. Rose studied him carefully. I believe your father taught you well. She didn't ask another question. Yet Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that she knew there was much more to Edward than he admitted. That afternoon, Daniel Carter parked several streets away and walked toward the small neighborhood cafe, where he and Ethan had agreed to meet once each week. Daniel froze when he saw the damaged wheelchair leaning against the cafe wall. What happened? Ethan quietly explained everything. Daniel's face darkened. They attacked you? For young men. And the police? No one called them. Daniel clenched his jaw. They should have been arrested. Perhaps. You sound calm. Ethan stirred his untouched coffee. I've been thinking. About what? If I had been Ethan Cole that night. He looked through the cafe window. Security would have surrounded me. The police would have arrived in minutes. The story would have made national headlines. Daniel nodded silently. But Edward. He gave a sad smile. Edward became another forgotten incident. Daniel leaned forward. Ethan. This experiment has gone far enough. You've proven your point. No. I haven't. You almost got seriously hurt. I know. You can't keep risking your life. Ethan looked down at his hands. I came searching for one answer. And now, I've discovered hundreds of questions. Daniel sighed. You've changed. I hope so. No. You really have. Daniel smiled faintly. The old Ethan would have spent this meeting discussing market expansion. And the new Ethan? He wants to know why strangers ignored a man lying on the sidewalk. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Daniel reached into his briefcase. I brought your company reports. Ethan shook his head. Leave them. You don't want to read them? Not today. Daniel looked surprised. The man who once studied financial statements before breakfast no longer seemed interested. Instead, he was worried about a kindergarten teacher trying to buy a wheelchair she couldn't afford. The next morning, Hannah arrived later than usual. She looked flustered. I'm sorry. What happened? I visited 3 medical supply stores before work. Edward frowned. You were looking for wheelchairs. She smiled sheepishly. I found a used one. His heart sank. Hannah, it's still expensive. You shouldn't. I know. I've been saving. For what? She hesitated. A washing machine. Edward looked confused. Our apartment building's laundry room broke months ago. We wash everything by hand. Rose's arthritis has been getting worse. I've been putting money aside. She smiled. But a washing machine can wait. He stared at her. You'd spend your savings on me? She looked genuinely puzzled. You need a wheelchair. And your grandmother? We'll manage. Those words struck Ethan like a physical blow. We'll manage. How many times had she sacrificed her own comfort to help someone else? He couldn't count anymore. He wanted to tell her the truth. He wanted to say, Hannah, I could buy 1,000 wheelchairs. I could buy your apartment building. I could pay every medical bill your grandmother will ever have. Instead, he simply whispered, Thank you. That afternoon, while Hannah was teaching, Ethan sat alone beneath the maple tree. A businessman accidentally dropped an expensive leather wallet while hurrying toward a taxi. Edward noticed immediately. Sir. The man didn't hear him. Edward pushed his wheelchair forward as quickly as he could. Sir. Finally, the businessman turned. My wallet. The man looked down, shocked. He quickly checked the contents. Everything was still there. Several $1,000s in cash. Credit cards. Business documents. He looked at Edward. You could have kept this. Edward smiled. It isn't mine. The businessman reached inside the wallet. Please. Take this. He offered several $100s. Edward shook his head. No. You earned it. I returned what belonged to you. The businessman stared at him for several seconds, then quietly placed the money back into his wallet. Instead, he extended his hand. Thank you. Edward accepted the handshake. It lasted only a moment, but somehow it felt significant. For the first time since becoming homeless, someone had shaken his hand. Not because of his wealth, not because of his influence, simply because they respected his honesty. Across the street, Hannah had arrived early after school. She had witnessed the entire exchange. She waited until the businessman left. You turned down all that money. Edward shrugged. It wasn't mine. She sat beside him. Most people would have accepted the reward. Maybe. You didn't. He smiled. My father taught me something. What? Character is who you are when no one is watching. She looked at him thoughtfully. Your father sounds remarkable. He was. She smiled. I think he'd be proud of you. Ethan lowered his eyes. I hope so. The words were genuine. He hadn't spoken about his father in months. Memories flooded back. His father's quiet integrity. His insistence that success meant nothing without honor. For a brief moment, Ethan wondered what his father would think if he could see him now, pretending to be a homeless man, learning lessons worth more than every business degree he'd ever earned. That evening, Rose noticed Hannah sitting quietly by the apartment window. What are you thinking about? Hannah smiled absent-mindedly. Edward. Rose raised an eyebrow. What about him? I can't explain it. She looked toward the darkening street. Sometimes he says things that sound like they come from someone who's lived several different lives. Rose nodded slowly. He has kind eyes. He does. And sad ones. Hannah sighed. I wish he'd tell me what happened to him. Rose smiled gently. People speak about their pain when they're ready. I know. I just don't want him carrying it alone. Rose reached over and squeezed her granddaughter's hand. Be patient. If he's meant to trust you, he will. Late that night, Ethan sat alone on the apartment balcony after everyone had gone to bed. The city glittered in the distance. Thousands of lights stretched across the skyline. Among them stood the illuminated headquarters of Cole International Holdings. His company, his empire, his old life. He hadn't set foot there in months. His phone vibrated quietly. A secure message from Daniel. Board growing concerned. Ryan Morgan increasing pressure. Victoria has hired private investigators. They're asking questions about your disappearance. Ethan stared at the message. His peaceful world beneath the maple tree suddenly felt fragile. Secrets had a way of refusing to stay buried. He looked through the apartment window. Hannah and Rose were asleep. Two women who had welcomed a stranger into their home without asking for anything in return. They believed he was Edward, a lonely man with nowhere else to go. The longer he stayed, the heavier the lie became. Every shared meal, every conversation, every smile, every act of kindness made the truth harder to tell. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and closed his eyes. For the first time since beginning this journey, he found himself asking a question he had carefully avoided. What would happen when Hannah discovered that Edward Brooks had never existed at all? The thought settled heavily over his heart, because for the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't afraid of losing his fortune. He was afraid of losing the one person who had loved him without ever knowing he was a billionaire. For the first time in months, Ethan dreaded sunrise. He sat alone beneath the familiar maple tree long before the morning rush began. The business district was still quiet. Delivery trucks rolled through the empty streets, and a few cafe owners arranged chairs outside their storefronts. Normally, these peaceful moments brought him comfort. Today they brought anxiety. Daniel's message from the previous night echoed in his mind. Victoria has hired private investigators. They're asking questions about your disappearance. He had known this day might come. No secret could remain hidden forever. Still, he had hoped for more time. More mornings with Hannah. More conversations beneath the maple tree. More days as Edward. A few more ordinary moments before reality came crashing back. Walter pushed his shopping cart toward him, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. You look troubled. Edward accepted one of the cups. I didn't sleep much. Walter sat beside him. I've learned something about life. Oh, when people stop sleeping, they're usually carrying something too heavy. Edward stared into the steam rising from the coffee. I think my burden is catching up with me. Walter nodded thoughtfully. You don't have to tell me. But whatever it is, it won't stay hidden forever. Edward managed a weak smile. I know. Across town, in a luxurious penthouse overlooking the city, Victoria Lane stood impatiently beside a floor-to-ceiling window. A sharply dressed private investigator entered the room carrying a thin brown envelope. I believe we've found him. Victoria spun around immediately. You've located Ethan? The investigator placed several photographs on the marble table. Victoria leaned forward. The first photograph showed a homeless man sitting beneath a maple tree. Dirty clothes, gray beard, a battered wheelchair. The second photograph captured him laughing with Hannah. The third showed him sharing coffee with Walter. Victoria frowned. Why are you showing me a beggar? The investigator slid another photograph forward. This one had been digitally enhanced. The beard had been partially removed. The facial structure carefully analyzed. The investigator tapped the image. We're 98% certain this man is Ethan Cole. Victoria stared in disbelief. That's impossible. We ran facial comparisons using multiple software systems. The disguise is exceptional, but the bone structure matches. Her eyes widened. You're saying the richest man in the country has been living as a homeless cripple? Yes. Victoria's expression slowly changed from disbelief to anger. He lied to everyone. The investigator nodded. What would you like us to do? Victoria looked at the photographs again. A slow smile appeared. No, I know exactly what to do. That same afternoon, Ryan Morgan sat inside a luxurious corporate office. Victoria placed the photographs on his desk. Ryan examined them carefully. A grin spread across his face. So, our missing billionaire has been playing dress-up. Victoria folded her arms. This is your opportunity. Ryan leaned back in his chair. No, it's our opportunity. He looked at the photographs again. The board still trusts Ethan, but shareholders hate uncertainty. He tapped the picture of Edward. What happens when the public discovers their billionaire CEO abandoned his company to pretend to be homeless? Victoria smiled coldly. His reputation collapses. And while everyone watches the scandal, Ryan finished her sentence. I take control of Cole International. They shook hands. Neither cared about Ethan. Neither cared about the truth. All they cared about was what they could gain. The next morning began like every other, at least on the surface. Hannah arrived carrying a paper bag. "I brought blueberry muffins." Edward smiled. "You'll spoil me." "I doubt that." She handed him one. "My students helped again." He laughed. "Should I prepare for burnt edges?" "They're improving." Walter wandered over. "They're still burnt." Hannah pretended to glare at him. "I thought you were on my side." "I'm on the side of honest baking." All three laughed together. For a few precious minutes, everything felt normal. Then a black SUV stopped across the street. Another arrived behind it. Then another. Walter frowned. "That's unusual." Edward felt his stomach tighten. Car doors opened. Men carrying expensive cameras stepped onto the sidewalk. Television crews followed. Reporters hurried toward the maple tree. People immediately slowed to watch. "What is this? Who's here? Is someone famous?" Within seconds, microphones surrounded Edward. Camera shutters clicked non-stop. Flash after flash lit the sidewalk. A reporter shouted, "Mr. Cole." Another voice echoed, "Ethan Cole." The color drained from Hannah's face. She looked at Edward, then at the reporters, then back again. One journalist stepped forward. "Mr. Cole, why have you been pretending to be a homeless, disabled man?" Another yelled, "Did you fake your disappearance? Was this a publicity stunt? Did your shareholders know? Is Cole International in crisis?" Questions came from every direction. Edward closed his eyes. The moment had arrived. Slowly, he opened them again. He looked at Hannah. She stared back in complete confusion. "What?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Are they talking about?" Edward didn't answer. He couldn't. Another reporter held up a magazine with Ethan's photograph on the cover. The resemblance was unmistakable, even through the makeup. Hannah looked from the magazine to Edward. "No." She shook her head. "No." A television cameraman zoomed in as Edward quietly reached toward his beard. The adhesive had already begun loosening in the afternoon heat. He slowly peeled away part of the prosthetic. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Beneath the disguise, the face of Ethan Cole appeared. Flash, flash, flash. Camera shutters exploded like fireworks. Someone shouted, "It's really him." Another reporter yelled into her microphone, "We can now confirm that missing billionaire Ethan Cole has been found alive." The crowd erupted into chaos. Walter stood frozen. Rose, who had come to bring Hannah lunch, covered her mouth in disbelief. Hannah couldn't move. She simply stared. Her lips trembled. "Ethan." He looked at her. "I'm sorry." The words sounded painfully small against the noise surrounding them. She took one slow step backward. "No. Hannah. You." She struggled to breathe. "You lied to me. I wanted to explain." "When? When were you planning to explain?" He had no answer. Every opportunity had seemed too soon, then too late. Now, there was nothing left. Tears filled Hannah's eyes. "Edward doesn't exist." "He does." She laughed bitterly. "No. He never existed. The man I shared breakfast with. The man my grandmother welcomed into our home. The man I defended." She shook her head. "None of him was real. It was real. My feelings were real. My friendship was real. My name wasn't." She looked at him with overwhelming disappointment. "Do you know what hurts the most?" He remained silent. "I never cared that you were poor. I never cared where you came from. I would have accepted any truth." She wiped away a tear. "But you never trusted me enough to tell it." The words pierced deeper than any insult ever could. She wasn't angry because he was rich. She was heartbroken because he had hidden himself. "I was afraid." His voice cracked. "Of what?" "That, if you knew, you'd see Ethan before Edward." She stared at him for several seconds, then quietly replied, "You made that decision for me." Silence. Heavy. Painful. "I deserved the chance to choose." He lowered his head. "You're right." Another reporter pushed forward. "Miss, when did you discover you were helping a billionaire?" Hannah turned sharply. "I didn't." "Were the two of you romantically involved?" She ignored the question. Another microphone appeared. "Did Ethan Cole manipulate you?" She stepped away from the cameras. "I don't want to talk." Someone continued shouting questions. She simply walked, slowly at first, then faster. Finally, she disappeared into the growing crowd. Ethan instinctively tried to follow. Security officers, summoned by Daniel moments earlier, arrived and formed a protective circle around him. "Mr. Cole, we need to leave." "No, I have to talk to her. It isn't safe." "I don't care." Daniel pushed through the reporters. "Ethan." She left. His shoulders slumped. He looked toward the street where Hannah had vanished. For the first time since beginning the experiment, he wished he had never created Edward Brooks. That evening, every television station carried the same breaking news. Missing billionaire found living as homeless man. News anchors replayed the footage endlessly. Images of Ethan removing his disguise filled every screen. Social media exploded with opinions. Some praised him. Others condemned him. Conspiracy theories spread within hours. Had it been an elaborate publicity stunt? A psychological experiment? A mental breakdown? No one knew. Only one person mattered to Ethan. He sat alone inside Daniel's lakeside estate once more. The makeup had been completely removed. The expensive suit Daniel insisted he wear felt strangely unfamiliar. His phone buzzed constantly. Hundreds of missed calls. Thousands of messages. Board members. Politicians. Journalists. Investors. He ignored every one of them. Daniel quietly entered the room. "She's home." Ethan looked up immediately. "Is she all right?" "Rose says she's been crying." Ethan closed his eyes. "I hurt the one person I never wanted to hurt." Daniel sat beside him. "You lied." "I know. You had reasons." "I know. But reasons don't erase pain." Ethan nodded slowly. "No, they don't." He walked toward the window overlooking the lake. For months he had searched for proof that genuine kindness still existed. He had found it. But in protecting the experiment, he had betrayed the very trust that kindness had built. Outside, the sun disappeared below the horizon. Darkness settled over the water. For the first time since losing Victoria, Ethan felt something far worse than heartbreak. Regret. Because fortunes could be rebuilt. Companies could recover. Reputations could be repaired. But trust, once broken, was far more difficult to earn back. And as night swallowed the last traces of daylight, Ethan wondered if he had lost Hannah forever. The morning after the truth was revealed, Ethan Cole woke to a world that suddenly knew exactly where he had been. Unfortunately, no one understood why. By 6 o'clock, every major television network was broadcasting the same story. Newspapers across the country carried enormous front-page headlines. Missing billionaire found living as homeless man. Ethan Cole's secret life shocks the nation. Publicity stunt or search for true love. Clips of Ethan removing his prosthetic beard beneath the maple tree played repeatedly on television and flooded every social media platform. Commentators debated his motives. Business analysts questioned his judgment. Psychologists speculated about his emotional state. Millions of strangers formed opinions about a story they knew almost nothing about. Ethan sat alone in the library of his lakeside estate, staring at one of the television screens without really seeing it. The sound was muted. He didn't need to hear the opinions. He could already imagine them. The only opinion that mattered belonged to one woman, and she wasn't speaking. Daniel Carter walked into the library carrying a stack of newspapers. He dropped them gently onto the coffee table. "They're saying everything." Ethan glanced down. One newspaper called him courageous. Another described him as reckless. A financial publication questioned whether someone capable of abandoning a billion-dollar company could still be trusted to lead it. A celebrity magazine focused almost entirely on his broken engagement to Victoria Lane. Daniel sighed. "You don't have to read any of it. I'm not interested in what they think. I know. You only care what Hannah thinks. Ethan leaned back in his chair. I keep replaying our last conversation. Daniel sat opposite him. You can't change yesterday. No. But I should have changed months ago. Silence filled the room. Finally Ethan spoke again. I should have trusted her. Daniel nodded. Yes. I kept telling myself I was protecting the experiment. He gave a bitter laugh. But somewhere along the way, I started protecting myself instead. Daniel didn't disagree. Across the city, Hannah sat quietly at the small kitchen table in her apartment. Her untouched cup of tea had grown cold. Grandma Rose folded another blanket and placed it over the back of a chair before sitting beside her granddaughter. You haven't eaten. I'm not hungry. Rose looked at the newspaper lying on the table. A large photograph showed Ethan in an expensive navy blue suit attending a charity gala nearly a year earlier. Next to it was another photograph taken beneath the maple tree. The contrast was astonishing. One image showed one of the country's most powerful businessmen. The other showed Edward, the man who had shared homemade muffins with children, the man who laughed over chess games, the man who had sat in their tiny apartment wearing Grandpa's old pajamas. Rose spoke gently. He's still the same person. Hannah shook her head. I don't know. You do. He lied. Yes. He looked me in the eyes every day. Yes. And every day. Her voice broke. He let me believe something that wasn't true. Rose reached across the table and held her hand. Do you think he cared about you? Hannah looked away. I don't know what to believe anymore. By midday, Cripple International Holdings announced an emergency press conference. The event was scheduled for 2 o'clock. Hundreds of reporters gathered outside the company's headquarters hours before it began. Satellite trucks lined the streets. Television crews occupied every available space. Employees whispered nervously in the hallways. Inside the executive boardroom, Ryan Morgan leaned back comfortably in his chair. This is perfect. Several board members looked confused. Perfect. Ryan smiled. Share prices have already started falling. We need stability. And Ethan has just destroyed public confidence. Another director frowned. He's still the majority shareholder. For now. Ryan calmly folded his hands. If investors panic, they'll demand new leadership. His eyes gleamed with quiet ambition. This company has never been more vulnerable. He wasn't worried about Ethan's emotional state. He wasn't concerned about the truth. He saw only opportunity. At precisely 2 o'clock, Ethan stepped onto the stage inside the company's media auditorium. The room erupted with camera flashes. Hundreds of reporters immediately began shouting questions. Mr. Cripple, why did you disappear? Did you deceive your shareholders? Were you mentally unstable? Was this an advertising campaign? Ethan stood silently behind the podium until the room gradually settled. He wore a simple dark suit. No expensive watch. No flashy accessories. No attempt to project power. Only quiet composure. He adjusted the microphone. My name is Ethan Cripple. A strange way to begin. Yet somehow it felt appropriate. For the past several months, I have lived under another name. He paused. My actions have caused confusion. They've caused concern. And they've hurt people I never intended to hurt. His voice softened slightly. For that, I sincerely apologize. The room remained unusually quiet. He continued, many of you have asked why. He looked around the auditorium. The answer begins long before I disappeared. He spoke about Victoria. Not with bitterness. Not with anger. Simply with honesty. I believed I had found someone who loved me. I was wrong. I overheard a conversation that made me question whether anyone could truly separate me from my wealth. He took a slow breath. So I decided to remove the wealth. The title, the reputation, the privilege. I wanted to discover how the world treated someone who appeared to have nothing. A reporter interrupted. So this was a social experiment? Ethan shook his head. No, it became one. But it began as something much more personal. It began with loneliness. The room fell silent again. I learned more during those months than during the previous 15 years of building my company. His eyes reflected genuine emotion. I learned that people often stop seeing those who have fallen. I learned that many disabilities become invisible because society chooses not to look. I learned that homelessness is far more complicated than most people imagine. And I learned, he smiled faintly, that genuine kindness still exists. For the first time, several reporters stopped taking notes. They simply listened. Near the back of the room, Daniel quietly watched. He had encouraged Ethan to keep the speech short. Instead, Ethan spoke from the heart. No business success. No financial achievement. No award I have ever received. He paused. Has taught me as much as sitting in that wheelchair beneath a maple tree. I met veterans. I met widows. I met people abandoned by their families. I met individuals whose stories deserved to be heard. His expression became more determined. I also met remarkable people who helped strangers without expecting recognition. He didn't mention Hannah by name. He didn't need to. She knew exactly who he meant. At that exact moment, Hannah sat in the teacher's lounge during her lunch break. The press conference played on a small television mounted in the corner. Several teachers watched quietly. One whispered, "That's the billionaire you used to talk to?" Hannah nodded without taking her eyes off the screen. Another teacher looked astonished. "You never knew?" "No." Ethan continued speaking. "I understand why some people feel betrayed. They have every right to. I lied about my identity. I accept responsibility for that. But I ask you to understand one thing. My feelings." He hesitated. "My friendships. The gratitude I felt toward those who showed me kindness. None of those were ever false." Hannah lowered her eyes. A tear rolled silently down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away before anyone noticed. Questions resumed. "Mr. Cole, will you resign as CEO?" "No." "Do you regret your decision?" Ethan thought carefully. "I regret hurting innocent people. I don't regret what I learned." Another reporter stood. "What happens now?" Ethan nodded slowly. "I'm glad you asked." He stepped away from the podium. A large screen behind him illuminated. Architectural renderings appeared. Shelters, training centers, medical clinics, affordable housing communities. "I am establishing the Edward Foundation." Several reporters looked puzzled. "The foundation will focus on homelessness, disability support, job training, and affordable housing." Another image appeared. Wheelchair accessibility programs, mobile health clinics, mental health services, scholarship funds. "I'm committing $1 billion of my personal wealth to begin this work." The room erupted with surprised murmurs. "This isn't charity. It's responsibility." He looked directly into the cameras. "I've spent years creating wealth. It's time to use more of it creating dignity." Applause began quietly. One journalist, then another. Soon much of the auditorium joined in. Not everyone applauded, but many did. That evening, news coverage shifted dramatically. Instead of questioning only his disappearance, outlets discussed the newly announced foundation. Commentators debated whether $1 billion could transform homelessness programs. Interviews featured disability advocates who welcomed the attention Ethan had brought to accessibility issues. Public opinion remained divided. Some insisted he had manipulated everyone. Others believed he had exposed uncomfortable truths society preferred to ignore. Ethan paid little attention. He had one final stop. As dusk settled over the city, Ethan stood alone beneath the maple tree. The reporters were gone. The cameras had disappeared. Traffic flowed normally once more. The battered wheelchair no longer sat beneath the branches. Only a faint impression remained where it had rested for months. He walked slowly to the exact spot where Edward had spent so many mornings. He closed his eyes. He could almost hear Hannah laughing, Walter teasing them over chess, children proudly showing crayon drawings. For months, this corner had become more of a home than any mansion he owned. Walter approached quietly from across the street. "I wondered if you'd come back." Ethan smiled. "I had to." Walter studied him. Without the disguise, he looked younger, stronger, but strangely, also sadder. "You told the truth today." "I tried." Walter nodded. "Truth usually costs something." "It did." "You think she'll forgive you?" Ethan looked toward the street where Hannah usually appeared each morning. "I don't know." Walter rested a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever happens, you changed." Ethan smiled faintly. "I hope so." "No." Walter shook his head. "I know so." They stood together beneath the fading evening light. For months Ethan had searched for proof that kindness still existed. Now he understood another lesson. Truth demanded courage. Not because it always repaired what was broken, but because living honestly was the only path toward healing. He looked one last time at the empty sidewalk. Tomorrow Hannah would probably walk this way on her way to school. Whether she stopped or kept walking, he couldn't predict. For the first time since becoming Edward Brooks, Ethan understood that some things couldn't be earned with determination, intelligence, or wealth. Forgiveness had to be freely given, and all he could do now was hope that one day the woman who had first seen a lonely man in a wheelchair might find it in her heart to see him again. 3 months passed. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the city in shades of gold and amber. The maple tree that had once sheltered Edward now scattered its leaves across the sidewalk where thousands of commuters still hurried each morning. Life had continued, at least for everyone else. For Ethan Cole, every day seemed incomplete. Cole International Holdings had stabilized after weeks of uncertainty. Investors regained confidence. The Edward Foundation had already opened its first emergency shelter, funded new wheelchair accessibility programs, and partnered with hospitals to provide medical care for homeless families. Business magazines once again praised Ethan's leadership. Television interviews called him an inspiring philanthropist. His schedule filled with meetings. His company recovered. His reputation slowly healed. But his heart remained exactly where he had left it, beneath a maple tree, with a kindergarten teacher who no longer spoke to him. Every Friday afternoon, Ethan found himself driving through Hannah's neighborhood, not to disturb her, not to convince her, simply to make sure she was all right. He never parked directly in front of her apartment building. Instead, he stopped at the small park across the street. Sometimes he watched children playing on the swings. Sometimes he watched Rose watering the flowers outside the apartment. Occasionally he caught a glimpse of Hannah returning from school with her worn shoulder bag full of colorful drawings. He never approached. He had made himself one promise. If Hannah ever forgave him, it had to be because she freely chose to, not because he pressured her. One Saturday morning, Walter appeared at the park carrying his familiar shopping cart. He spotted Ethan sitting alone on a bench. "So," Ethan smiled. "So, you've been coming here every week." "I know." "You planning to buy the neighborhood?" Ethan laughed quietly. "No. I already own enough." Walter nodded thoughtfully. "Then why are you here?" Ethan looked toward Hannah's apartment building. "Hope." Walter followed his gaze. "Still love her?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "More than ever." Walter sat beside him. "You know, I've spent most of my life with nothing." Ethan listened quietly. "And I learned something." "What?" "The hardest thing to earn isn't money." "What is it?" "A second chance." Walter looked at him. "You don't ask for it. You become worthy of it." Those words stayed with Ethan long after Walter left. Across the street, Hannah stood behind her living room curtain. She had seen Ethan's car. Not just today. For weeks. She watched him sitting quietly on the park bench. Never approaching. Never knocking. Never sending gifts. Never asking to speak with her. Grandma Rose noticed her granddaughter staring through the window. "He's here again." Hannah nodded. "He hasn't bothered us once." "No." Rose smiled gently. "He simply waits." Hannah looked away. "I don't understand him." "Perhaps you do." "I don't." Rose folded another towel before continuing. "If he wanted to impress you, He could fill this apartment with expensive furniture. He could pay every medical bill. He could buy this entire building. He hasn't. No. What has he done instead? Hannah remained silent. He waits. Later that afternoon, Hannah volunteered at the community reading center where she spent 2 Saturdays every month reading stories to children from low-income families. She had volunteered there long before meeting Edward. It helped her remember why she became a teacher. As she arranged children's books on a small shelf, the center's director approached. Hannah. Yes. Someone made a donation. Oh. The director handed her a sealed envelope. There wasn't a name. Hannah opened it carefully. Inside was a check. It covered an entire year's worth of children's books. No signature. Only a handwritten note. Every child deserves a story. Nothing else. The handwriting looked strangely familiar. Her heart skipped. She quietly folded the note and placed it back inside the envelope. That evening, Ethan sat in Daniel's office overlooking the city. Daniel closed a financial report. You've become difficult. Ethan looked up. In what way? You refuse publicity. You decline award ceremonies. You turned down 3 magazine covers. Ethan smiled. I've had enough attention. Daniel studied him carefully. The old Ethan would have accepted every invitation. The old Ethan thought success needed applause. And now, I'd rather spend the afternoon reading to children. Daniel laughed. I never thought I'd hear you say that. Ethan looked toward the window. Neither did I. After a brief silence, Daniel asked the question that had been on his mind for weeks. When are you going to speak to Hannah? Ethan sighed. When she's ready. And if she never is? Ethan looked down at his hands. Then I'll spend the rest of my life respecting that decision. Daniel leaned back thoughtfully. You really love her. I do. For the first time. I don't want someone to admire my success. I just want one person to believe my heart. Several days later, Ethan received an unexpected phone call. Walter. I think it's time. Ethan immediately stood. What happened? Nothing bad. Then, I think she's ready to listen. An hour later, Ethan stood outside Hannah's apartment building. His heart pounded harder than it ever had during billion-dollar negotiations. He wasn't wearing an expensive designer suit. Instead, he chose a simple navy blue sweater and dark trousers. No security, no chauffeur, no luxury car waiting outside. Just Ethan. He climbed the familiar staircase slowly. When he reached apartment 2B, he hesitated, then gently knocked. A few seconds later, the door opened. Hannah stood there. Neither spoke. Months of silence filled the narrow hallway. Finally, she stepped aside. Come in. The apartment looked exactly as he remembered. The same curtains. The same small dining table. The same family photographs. Only one thing had changed. The old pajamas Grandpa Rose had lent Edward were neatly folded on the sofa. She had kept them. Rose appeared from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of tea. I'll visit my friend downstairs. She smiled warmly at Ethan. Take your time. She quietly closed the apartment door behind her. Silence settled once again. Hannah motioned toward the sofa. Sit. He did. She remained standing for another moment before finally sitting opposite him. Neither knew where to begin. Finally, Ethan spoke. I've rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times. She gave a faint smile. And I was wrong every time. A small laugh escaped her before she quickly looked away. I don't expect forgiveness. He continued. I came because I owe you the truth. I finally know all of it. She looked at him. I know. But you've never heard it from me. She nodded. Go on. Ethan took a deep breath. The night I overheard Victoria. He told her everything. Not the version newspapers reported. The real version. The loneliness. The broken engagement. The fear that no one could ever separate Ethan Cole from his fortune. His decision to disappear. His guilt every time he lied to her. The longer I knew you, he admitted quietly, the harder it became. Why didn't you tell me? He looked directly into her eyes. Because I was selfish. I kept thinking, just one more day. Then another. Then another. I was terrified. She listened without interrupting. I knew the truth might make you leave. So I convinced myself waiting was better. He lowered his head. It wasn't. No, it wasn't. Silence returned. Not uncomfortable. Simply honest. After several moments, Hannah finally spoke. Do you know what I did the day after I found out? He shook his head. I walked to the maple tree. She smiled sadly. I sat where you used to sit. I kept asking myself, which conversations were real? The jokes, the chess games, the stories. She looked up. I couldn't decide. Ethan's voice became almost a whisper. Every one of those moments was real. I laughed because you made me laugh. I looked forward to seeing you every morning. I worried when you didn't come. I loved listening to stories about your students. My feelings never belonged to the disguise. They belonged to you. A tear slipped down Hannah's cheek. I wanted to hate you. He closed his eyes. I know. I couldn't. He looked up in surprise. She smiled through tears. That made me even angrier. They both laughed softly. The tension that had filled the apartment for months began to loosen. Hannah reached into a drawer beside the sofa. She placed something gently on the table. The crayon drawing from her students. The one that showed Edward and Hannah standing beneath the maple tree, with one word written above them. Friends. I couldn't throw it away. She looked at the drawing. Every time I tried, I remembered the man who helped children learn chess. The man who returned a stranger's wallet. The man who thanked my grandmother after every meal. She looked directly at Ethan. I kept wondering, were those things Edward did? Or Ethan? Ethan answered without hesitation. Me. She smiled. Exactly. Another silence. This one felt lighter. Finally Hannah asked the question that had lived inside her heart for months. If you had never been rich, if Coal International had never existed, if you were simply an ordinary man, she searched his face. Would you still be the person I met beneath that tree? Ethan didn't answer immediately. He wanted every word to matter. My father taught me that integrity is worth more than money. My mother taught me kindness. I lost my way for a while. I confused success with happiness. But the man you met, he wasn't created by the disguise. He was the person I should have been all along. His eyes met hers. So yes, I would still be that man. Tears filled Hannah's eyes once more. She stood slowly, walked across the room, stopped directly in front of him. For several long seconds she simply looked at him. Then she reached out and gently took his hands. I never fell in love with the billionaire. She smiled through tears. I fell in love with the man who thanked me for a burnt muffin. Ethan laughed. It was delicious. It was terrible. It was made with kindness. So was the hot chocolate. So were the pancakes. So was every conversation. She squeezed his hands gently. I don't need Ethan Cole. I need the man who remembers children's names. The man who shares sandwiches. The man who cried while eating grandma's soup. She stepped closer. I choose him. Emotion overwhelmed Ethan. I don't deserve you. Maybe not. She smiled playfully. But you're going to spend the rest of your life trying. He laughed through tears. I'll gladly accept that challenge. Without another word, Hannah wrapped her arms around him. For the first time in months, the emptiness inside Ethan disappeared. He held her carefully, as though afraid the moment might disappear if he moved too quickly. Outside, golden autumn leaves drifted gently past the apartment window. Inside, two people who had met without wealth, titles, or expectations finally found each other again. Not because one was a billionaire. Not because one had forgiven every mistake. But because both had chosen something far more valuable. Truth, trust, and a love that had first been built beneath a maple tree, when one lonely man believed the world had forgotten him and one kind woman simply chose to stop. 1 year later, the city had changed. Or perhaps Ethan had simply learned to see it differently. The towering glass buildings still reflected the morning sun. Luxury cars still lined the streets outside Cripple International Holdings. Business executives still rushed from one meeting to another with phones pressed to their ears. Yet every time Ethan drove through the business district, his eyes no longer lingered on the skyscrapers. They always found the maple tree. It still stood beside the subway entrance, its branches stretching over the same patch of sidewalk where Edward Brooks had once spent months watching the world pass him by. The wheelchair was gone. The paper cup had disappeared. The blanket Hannah had bought him had long since been carefully folded and stored in a cedar chest at their home. But the memories remained. Every single one. Sometimes Ethan parked nearby before work and sat quietly on the same bench where Hannah had once shared coffee with him. Not because he missed pretending to be Edward, but because that corner of the city reminded him of the man he never wanted to lose again. Inside Cripple International Holdings, life had settled into a healthier rhythm. The company remained one of the largest corporations in the country, but Ethan no longer measured success solely by quarterly profits. Board meetings had changed. Every meeting now began with one simple question: how will this decision improve people's lives? Some executives had found the question unusual at first. Now they expected it. Ryan Morgan had quietly resigned 6 months earlier after an internal investigation uncovered unethical financial practices and attempts to manipulate company shares during Ethan's disappearance. The board unanimously voted to remove him. For Ethan, it wasn't revenge. It was accountability. Victoria Lane had also disappeared from the headlines. After several unsuccessful interviews attempting to defend her actions, public interest gradually faded. Ethan never spoke badly about her. When reporters asked if he regretted their relationship, he simply replied, "Every painful experience can become a valuable teacher if we allow it." That answer ended most conversations. The Edward Foundation had grown beyond anything Ethan imagined. What began as a $1 billion commitment had inspired other companies, charities, and private donors to contribute. Across the country, shelters were opening. Job training centers were helping people rebuild their lives. Mobile medical clinics visited neighborhoods that had long been forgotten. Scholarships supported students from homeless families. Accessibility programs installed wheelchair ramps in schools, libraries, and public buildings. The foundation's slogan appeared on every building it operated: "No one left behind." Ethan insisted those words remain visible. "They're not for the people we're helping," he often said. "They're for the rest of us." One crisp autumn morning, Ethan stood inside one of the Foundation's newest community centers. Children raced through brightly painted hallways carrying books almost as large as they were. A classroom buzzed with adults learning computer skills. A nurse greeted patients in a small health clinic. Nearby, a carpenter taught several young men how to build furniture. Daniel walked beside Ethan. "You've been smiling all morning." "I have. You haven't stopped." Ethan watched a little girl proudly show her mother a book she had borrowed from the community library. "I spent years building companies." He smiled. "This feels different." Daniel nodded. "It does." A volunteer approached. "Mr. Cripple?" "Yes. Someone would like to meet you." An elderly man slowly entered the lobby using a new wheelchair. Walter. He looked healthier than Ethan had ever seen him. His beard was neatly trimmed. He wore clean clothes. His posture seemed stronger. Ethan broke into a wide smile. "Walter." The two men embraced warmly. "You look good," Ethan said. Walter laughed. "So do you." Daniel looked between them. "I haven't seen you in months." Walter nodded proudly. "I've been busy." "Busy? I manage the community garden now." He grinned. "Turns out tomatoes don't care where you used to sleep." They all laughed. Walter looked around the bustling center. "You really did it." Ethan shook his head. "We did." Walter smiled knowingly. "No. You just finally believed what Hannah saw from the beginning." Meanwhile, across town, Hannah stood in front of 20 excited kindergarten students. "Now, children," she said with a smile. "Who remembers what today is?" Tiny hands shot into the air. "Field trip." "That's right. Where are we going?" The Edward Community Center. The children cheered. Hannah laughed. She had refused Ethan's offer to stop teaching after they became engaged. "I didn't fall in love with a teacher," Ethan had joked one evening. She smiled. "You fell in love with someone who loves teaching. And I still do." So every weekday she remained exactly where she wanted to be. In a classroom, covered in glitter, surrounded by children who asked impossible questions. Nothing about success had changed that dream. 2 weeks later, friends and family gathered inside a beautiful botanical garden overlooking a quiet lake. The wedding had finally arrived. Many newspapers had offered to cover the ceremony. Every television network requested exclusive broadcasting rights. Ethan politely declined them all. "This day belongs to us." Instead of celebrities and politicians filling the front rows, the guest list reflected the people who had shaped their journey. Walter sat proudly in the second row, wearing his very first tailored suit. Grandma Rose smiled through happy tears. The teachers from Hannah's kindergarten chatted excitedly with volunteers from the Edward Foundation. Several families who had once lived in foundation shelters attended with their children. Construction workers, nurses, street vendors, sanitation workers, former homeless residents now rebuilding their lives, security guards, bus drivers, ordinary people, the kind of people who had quietly changed Ethan far more than any billionaire ever had. Soft music drifted through the garden as Hannah appeared. She wore a simple ivory gown, elegant, graceful, uncomplicated, exactly what she wanted. Ethan couldn't take his eyes off her. Daniel gently nudged him. "You should probably breathe." The guests laughed. As Hannah reached the end of the aisle, she smiled. "You clean up nicely." Ethan laughed. "So do you." The officiant welcomed everyone before asking Ethan to share his vows. He looked at Hannah, then took a slow breath. "1 year ago, I believed the greatest question in life was whether someone could love me without knowing I was rich." He smiled softly. "You answered a far better question." She tilted her head. "What was that?" "You showed me who I could become when I stopped hiding behind success." His voice grew emotional. "You taught me that dignity costs nothing. Kindness is never wasted. And home is found wherever someone chooses to see you." A tear rolled down Hannah's cheek. She took his hands. "My turn." The guests laughed gently. She smiled. "I met a lonely man in a wheelchair. I thought I was bringing him breakfast." She looked into Ethan's eyes. "I never realized he was feeding my own heart." Several guests quietly wiped away tears. "You once asked why I stopped." She squeezed his hands. "I stopped because I couldn't walk past someone in need." She smiled. "I stayed because I found someone worth walking beside for the rest of my life." There wasn't a dry eye in the garden. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, applause echoed across the lake. Walter stood first, then everyone else. The reception was joyful rather than extravagant. Children danced barefoot across the grass. Grandma Rose insisted everyone take home extra cake. Walter gave an unforgettable speech. "When I first met Edward," he began, grinning at Ethan, "I thought he wouldn't survive a week on the streets." The guests laughed. "He complained about cold mornings." Ethan protested. "I did not." Walter ignored him. "He didn't know how to eat a sandwich without folding the wrapper neatly." More laughter. But somewhere along the way, Walter's smile softened. He stopped pretending. He looked directly at Ethan. "You came searching for someone who could love you." He glanced toward Hannah. "You found her." Then he looked around at the guests. "But you also found yourself." The applause lasted several minutes. As evening settled over the city, the celebration slowly came to an end. Instead of leaving immediately for their honeymoon, Ethan looked at Hannah. "One more stop." She smiled knowingly. "The maple tree?" He nodded. "I thought you'd ask." They drove through the quiet business district just as the streetlights flickered on. The sidewalks were nearly empty. Only a few commuters hurried toward the subway station. Hand in hand, they walked to the familiar tree. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Hannah smiled. "You know." "What?" If I met Edward today, I'd still stop. Ethan looked at her. Even knowing everything? She nodded. Especially knowing everything. He wrapped an arm gently around her shoulders. Just then, an elderly man using a wheelchair slowly approached the corner. He looked tired, confused, alone. Several pedestrians walked around him without slowing. Hannah immediately stepped forward. "Good evening." The man looked up. "Good evening. Have you eaten today?" He hesitated before shaking his head. "No." She smiled warmly. "Wait right here." She looked at Ethan. "I know exactly where to get the best sandwiches." He laughed. "I thought you might." Together they crossed the street, returning a few moments later with warm food, bottled water, and coffee. They sat beside the man beneath the maple tree, not as a billionaire and his wife, not as founders of a famous charity, simply as two people sharing a meal with someone who needed kindness. As the evening breeze rustled the golden leaves overhead, Ethan looked around the quiet street. A year earlier he had believed the greatest treasure in his life rested inside bank accounts, office towers, and investment portfolios. Now he knew better. His greatest fortune was sitting beside him, laughing gently with a stranger over a simple sandwich. Money had built his empire. Compassion had built his life. And beneath the same maple tree where the world had once forgotten a lonely man in a wheelchair, Ethan realized that the greatest legacy he would ever leave behind would not be measured in billions. It would be measured in every person who chose to stop, to look, to care, to remind another human being that they were seen. Because in the end, true love had never found a billionaire. It had found a man. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to this channel and tell us where you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.